When my husband walked into my flagship restaurant on its opening night, he froze in the entryway. The same man who left me for his secretary just 1 month earlier, telling me my little cooking hobby would never amount to anything. The hostess asked if he had a reservation, but he just stared at me across the crowded dining room, watching as I moved confidently between tables of food critics and local celebrities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The look on his face when my new business partner introduced me as the culinary genius behind the most anticipated restaurant opening this year was worth every tear I'd shed and every sleepless night I'd endured after finding those text messages. On his phone, the elegant dining room of Maison Sauvage hummed with excitement on its grand opening night. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the meticulously arranged tables, each adorned with fresh wildflowers and hand-folded napkins. The air carried the intoxicating aromas of my signature dishes: herbes de Provence, caramelized shallots, and the rich, earthy scent of truffle oil. At 42, I stood taller than I had in years, my chef's coat crisp and embroidered with my name: Executive Chef Claire Winters. My hair, once perpetually tied back in a messy ponytail to accommodate my husband Mark's preference, now fell in soft waves around my shoulders when I wasn't in the kitchen. The sound of laughter and appreciative murmurs from satisfied patrons created a symphony that validated every decision I'd made since that devastating afternoon just 30 days ago. "Table 9 is asking to compliment the chef," whispered Sophie, my sous chef and the first person I'd hired when this whirlwind began. The food critic from the Tribune. I nodded, wiping my hands on the small towel tucked into my apron. As I emerged from the kitchen to greet my guests, I caught sight of Mark standing just inside the entrance, his expression a mixture of disbelief and regret. Beside him stood Rebecca, his secretary, no, his girlfriend, her hand clutching his arm, as she took in the sophisticated space I'd created. They hadn't seen me yet. For a moment, I allowed myself to observe them. Mark in his typical designer suit, the one I'd helped him select during happier times, and Rebecca in a dress that seemed deliberately chosen to draw attention. How small they suddenly appeared, in the world I'd built without them. James Collins, my business partner and the financial mind behind our rapidly growing restaurant group, intercepted me with a glass of champagne. "The Tribune critic is raving about your coq au vin," he said, his eyes crinkling with genuine pride. "Said it's the most transformative take on the classic he's experienced in a decade." He clinked his glass against mine. "To the first of many successful nights at Maison Sauvage, and to the chef who made it all possible." Several nearby diners overheard and raised their glasses in my direction. The sudden attention drew Mark's gaze directly to me, and our eyes locked across the room. The champagne flute in his hand tilted dangerously as recognition dawned. I didn't look away. The woman who would have shrunk under his scrutiny just 1 month ago had disappeared, replaced by someone who knew her worth down to the precise measurement of salt in a perfect sauce. I raised my glass slightly in his direction, a gesture that acknowledged our shared past while firmly establishing my liberated present. "Claire." James followed my gaze. "Do you know that couple by the door?" "My soon-to-be ex-husband," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "And the woman he left me for exactly 1 month ago today." Understanding flashed across James's face. He knew pieces of my story, enough to understand the significance of this moment. "Want me to have them seated in the back near the restrooms?" he offered with a conspiratorial smile. I laughed, the sound genuine and free. "No, give them the best table we have available, near the kitchen. I want them to have the full Maison Sauvage experience." James raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." I took a deliberate sip of champagne. Success is the best response to underestimation. As James made his way to the hostess stand, I returned to the table of the food critic, accepting his effusive compliments with gracious humility. In my peripheral vision, I watched as Mark and Rebecca were led to a prime table with a direct view of both the open kitchen and my interactions with admiring patrons. The strategic placement wasn't about petty revenge, it was about truth. Let them witness firsthand what Mark had dismissed as impossible. The evening continued in a blur of congratulations, perfectly executed dishes, and the intoxicating hum of a successful restaurant debut. I moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced ease, the months of training at the prestigious Le Cordon Bleu, classes I'd secretly taken during the final years of my faltering marriage, evident in every plate that left my kitchen. "The couple at table 12 would like to speak with you," Sophie informed me around 10 o'clock, her expression carefully neutral. "The man says he knows you." I nodded, wiping my hands on a towel. "I'll handle this." The walk to table 12 felt like crossing a bridge between my past and future. Mark's face grew increasingly uncertain with each step I took toward him. Rebecca's expression flickered between defensive hostility and reluctant admiration as she surveyed the restaurant. "Mark," I said, my voice professional yet warm. "Rebecca, I hope you're enjoying your evening at Maison Sauvage." Mark cleared his throat, his confidence visibly shaken. "Claire, this is unexpected. How did you— "The lamb is exquisite," Rebecca interjected, her voice carrying a hint of genuine surprise. "I've never had anything like it." "Thank you." I directed my response to her, choosing grace over grudges. "It's a contemporary take on my grandmother's recipe. The secret is in the 17-hour marinade." Mark stared at me as though seeing a stranger. In many ways he was. The Claire he'd known, the woman whose culinary school applications he'd discouraged, whose recipe testing he'd tolerated rather than celebrated, had transformed in his absence. "Your restaurant is incredible." He finally managed, the word "your" clearly difficult for him to reconcile with his perception of me. "James Collins is your business partner? The James Collins who owns half the restaurants downtown?" "Yes," I replied simply. "We met during a charity cooking event last year. He's been instrumental in launching Maison Sauvage." What I didn't add was how quickly James had recognized my talent when Mark never had, or how James had called the very day after Mark left, offering me the opportunity that would change everything. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Could we talk privately? Just for a moment?" Rebecca's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching for Mark's arm. The gesture revealed an insecurity I recognized all too well. I'd felt it myself countless times during our 15-year marriage. "Afraid that's not possible tonight," I replied, glancing around at the still busy restaurant. "Opening night requires my full attention. But please, enjoy your meal. It's on the house." "Claire!" Mark began, an undercurrent of the old authority in his voice. "Chef Winters," called my pastry chef from across the room. "The food photographer from Gourmet magazine needs you for the dessert presentation." I smiled at the impeccable timing. "If you'll excuse me, duty calls. Sophie will ensure you have everything you need." I turned toward the kitchen, then paused. "And Mark?" "The divorce papers are with my lawyer. Your signature is the only thing we're waiting for." As I walked away, I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the kitchen door. Shoulders back, chin high, eyes bright with purpose. The contrast with the woman I'd been just 30 days ago could not have been more profound. That woman had stood in our suburban kitchen, smartphone in trembling hands, reading text messages never meant for her eyes. That woman had crumpled to the floor when Mark came home, confessed without remorse, and informed her he was leaving. That woman had believed him when he said she'd never succeed without his support, that her culinary dreams were unrealistic fantasies. But that woman was gone. In her place stood Chef Claire Winters, who had transformed devastation into determination and was only just beginning to show the world, and her soon-to-be ex-husband, exactly what she was capable of creating from the ashes of her former life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Night continued in a symphony of flavors, compliments, and the satisfying rhythm of a restaurant operating at its peak. When Mark and Rebecca finally left, him casting repeated glances back toward the kitchen, her pulling him determinedly toward the exit, I felt nothing but a calm certainty that the path ahead, though unplanned, would be entirely my own creation. Hours later, as the last guests departed and the staff completed their closing duties, James found me in the kitchen, reviewing notes for tomorrow's service. "Remarkable first night, chef," he said, leaning against the immaculate counter. "The investors are thrilled. Restaurant critics are already posting rave reviews online. And..." He paused, sliding his phone toward me. "Our reservation system crashed from the volume of bookings coming in for the next 3 months." I exhaled slowly, allowing the reality of this success to fully register. 1 month ago, I'd been a housewife with deferred dreams and a husband who undervalued both my talents and my worth. Tonight, I stood in my own restaurant at the beginning of what promised to be a remarkable culinary journey. "Not bad for a little cooking hobby?" I murmured, echoing Mark's dismissive words from years of discouragement. James raised an eyebrow, not understanding the reference, but recognizing the significance of the moment. "This is just the beginning, Claire. The first location of many, if tonight is any indication." As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unsaved number I still recognized. Mark's. "We need to talk. I made a terrible mistake. Please call me." I stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone back into my pocket without responding. Whatever conversation Mark wanted to have would happen on my terms, in my time. For now, I had a successful restaurant to run and a future to create, one that had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined when he walked out the door just 1 month ago. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse apartment, illuminating the space I'd purchased with the first round of investment capital. 6 weeks had passed since opening night at Maison Sauvage, and life had transformed with breathtaking speed. I sipped my perfectly brewed coffee, a single-origin Ethiopian blend that had become my morning ritual, while reviewing the proposals spread across my marble countertop. 3 potential locations, I murmured to myself, tracing my finger along the architectural renderings. James had been right on opening night. Maison Sauvage was just the beginning. My home office had become command central for what food critics were now calling the fastest rising culinary star in the city. The wall opposite my desk displayed framed copies of glowing reviews. The Tribune had called my cuisine revolutionary in its elegant simplicity, while Food and Wine had featured me in their Chefs to Watch section just last week. The headline, "From Homemaker to Hospitality Mogul, Claire Winter's Remarkable Rise," still sent a thrill down my spine whenever I glanced at it. The apartment itself was everything my former home with Mark was not. Open, minimalist, filled with light and space for creativity. Gone were the heavy drapes and formal furniture he had insisted upon, replaced by clean lines, chef-worthy kitchen equipment, and art that spoke to my soul rather than his corporate image. The view of the city skyline reminded me daily of how far I'd climbed in such a short time. My phone chimed with a calendar alert. 9:30 a.m., meeting with restaurant group investors. I straightened my tailored blazer over a simple black dress, a far cry from the apologetic outfits I'd worn during my marriage, and gathered my portfolio of expansion plans. The woman reflected in the full-length mirror projected confidence, authority, and vision. Sometimes I still did a double take, momentarily surprised by this evolved version of myself. "Good morning, Chef Winters," called Eliza, my newly hired personal assistant, as I stepped into the private elevator. At 26, she possessed the organizational skills and discretion I needed as my professional obligations multiplied exponentially. Your car is waiting downstairs. I've sent the updated presentation to your tablet and confirmed lunch with the James Beard Foundation representative at noon. Thank you, Eliza. I accepted the tablet she handed me, already open to the day's schedule. Any word from Pascal about the seasonal menu changes? He sent the final draft at 6 a.m. I've forwarded it to your email, she replied efficiently. Also, your attorney called. The divorce papers have been delivered to Mr. Winters again, but he's still requesting a meeting before signing. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest at the mention of Mark, but it passed quickly. His repeated attempts to schedule a private conversation had evolved from desperate texts to formal requests through his lawyer, all while the divorce papers remained unsigned, keeping us legally bound despite his choice to leave. Tell Richard to inform Mr. Winters that my position remains unchanged, I said, referring to my attorney. The terms are more than fair. If he wants to discuss anything, he can do so through proper legal channels. The sleek black town car pulled away from my building into the morning traffic. Through the window, I watched the city pass by. The same streets I'd walked for years feeling invisible, now part of the empire I was building. My phone buzzed continuously with updates from the 3 restaurant locations. Maison Sauvage, our flagship fine dining establishment. Wild Root, the more casual farm-to-table concept we'd opened just 2 weeks ago. And preparations for Ember and Vine, the Mediterranean-inspired brasserie scheduled to open next month. Each message, each decision required of me, reinforced how dramatically my life had pivoted since Mark's departure. What he had viewed as a limitation, my passion for creating transcendent culinary experiences, had become the foundation of my unexpected success. At the investment firm's gleaming office tower, I was greeted with the deference reserved for valued clients. Chef Winters, the partners are eager to hear your expansion proposals, said the receptionist, leading me toward the conference room. They've been following the unprecedented success of both your restaurants. The conference room fell silent as I entered. 8 impeccably dressed financial executives, 7 men and 1 woman, rose from their seats in a show of respect that would have been unimaginable 2 months ago. Claire, wonderful to see you again, said Robert Keller, the head of the investment group, extending his hand. Everyone's been looking forward to hearing about your next phase of growth. The numbers from both Maison Sauvage and Wild Root have exceeded even our most optimistic projections. I set my portfolio on the polished table, appreciating the subtle shift in power dynamics. These were the same people who had initially questioned James's faith in an unknown chef with no formal restaurant management experience. Now they hung on my every word, eager to continue financing my expanding vision. Thank you, Robert. I'm excited to share what we've developed. I connected my tablet to the presentation system, and the room darkened as my carefully crafted business plan appeared on screen. As you can see, we're proposing not just Ember and Vine, which is already in development, but 2 additional concepts to round out our restaurant portfolio. For the next 45 minutes, I guided them through the culinary and business vision that had crystallized during the weeks of Maison Sauvage's triumph. I detailed profit margins, staffing structures, and marketing strategies with the same precision I once applied to perfecting a bechamel sauce. The confidence in my voice never wavered, even as I registered the surprise on some of their faces, still adjusting to the transformation from the hesitant woman who had initially attended. These meetings silently at James's side. Your projected timeline is ambitious, noted Diane Fisher, the only female partner studying the 5-restaurant plan. But given your track record so far, I'm inclined to believe you'll exceed it. We're prepared to increase our investment by 30%. Robert added, exchanging glances with his colleagues. Your restaurants aren't just successful, Claire. They're becoming cultural institutions in this city. The waiting list for Maison Sauvage reservations is approaching 3 months. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and enthusiastic commitments, I felt a surge of satisfaction that transcended simple pride. This was validation of the deepest kind, recognition of abilities I'd always possessed, but had kept carefully contained within the boundaries of my former life. Outside the investment firm, I paused on the sidewalk, taking a moment to absorb the beautiful spring day. Across the street stood Carlton Tower, the gleaming corporate headquarters where Mark worked as chief financial officer. For 15 years, I'd lived in the shadow of his success, arranging my schedule around his business, dinners, hosting his colleagues with meals he rarely appreciated. Now our professional worlds existed side by side in this financial district, though mine was expanding while his remained static. As if summoned by my thoughts, I spotted a familiar figure exiting the tower's revolving doors. Mark, engaged in conversation with two colleagues, hadn't noticed me yet. He looked different somehow, the confident stride slightly diminished, his designer suit hanging a bit looser on his frame. The woman beside him was not Rebecca, but another executive I recognized from company functions I'd attended as the supportive spouse. For a moment, I considered crossing the street in the opposite direction, avoiding an unplanned encounter. But the woman I'd become these past weeks didn't avoid difficult moments. She moved through them with grace and self-possession. I straightened my shoulders and continued along my planned route, which would take me directly past Mark's building toward my lunch appointment. As our paths converged, recognition flashed across his face, followed by a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. Surprise gave way to something that looked remarkably like longing. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying across the remaining distance between us. His colleagues glanced curiously between us, aware of some tension but not its nature. "Mark," I acknowledged with a polite nod, maintaining my pace. "Good morning." He mumbled hasty goodbyes to his companions and fell into step beside me. "You look." He searched for words, his eyes taking in my transformation. "Incredible. That article in Food and Wine barely did you justice." "Thank you," I replied, neither slowing nor inviting further conversation. The easy deference in his tone was new, a man accustomed to leading every interaction now struggling to establish footing. "I've been trying to reach you," he continued, slightly breathless from matching my determined stride. "There are things we need to discuss. Important things." I stopped then, turning to face him fully on the busy sidewalk. "The only thing we need to discuss is finalizing our divorce, which requires nothing more than your signature." His face flushed slightly. "It's not that simple, Claire. When I left, I made a horrible mistake. I didn't understand what you were capable of." "No," I interrupted, "you didn't. But that was never the problem, Mark. The problem was that you didn't want to understand. You preferred me in a box of your creation." The truth of those words hung between us as pedestrians streamed past. In his eyes I could see the struggle, a man confronting the reality that what he'd discarded had become something precious in the world's estimation. "My Uber is arriving," I said, gesturing toward the black SUV pulling to the curb. "If you want to communicate with me, please do so through our attorneys." "Claire, wait." His hand reached for my arm but stopped short of making contact, awareness of changed boundaries visible in his hesitation. "I have a lunch meeting with the James Beard Foundation," I said, opening the car door, "and then menu testing for Ember and Vine. Some of us are building something, Mark, not just seeking to reclaim what we carelessly threw away." As the car pulled away, I caught a final glimpse of him standing on the sidewalk, watching me depart. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. A month ago, I'd been the one left behind, watching him walk away with another woman. But unlike Mark, I wasn't looking back with regret. I was moving forward with purpose, creating a life that had outgrown the space he'd once occupied in it. The soft jazz playing throughout Maison Sauvage perfectly complemented the gentle clink of silverware and appreciative murmurs of diners enjoying their meals. 2 months since opening night, and the restaurant still operated at full capacity every evening, with reservations becoming as valuable as concert tickets in the city. I moved through the dining room for my nightly ritual of greeting guests, pausing at each table to ensure their experience exceeded expectations. "The mushroom risotto is life-changing," gushed a woman celebrating her anniversary. "How do you get such depth of flavor?" I smiled, sharing a carefully measured secret. "The porcini are foraged from the mountains upstate, and the stock simmers for 12 hours with roasted marrow bones. But the true secret is in the timing, knowing exactly when to stop stirring." Her husband raised his wine glass in salute. "We tried for weeks to get reservations, worth every minute of waiting." This was the part of my new life I treasured most, witnessing firsthand how my creations brought joy, created memories, sparked conversations. In the kitchen, I found purpose. In the dining room, I found validation of that purpose. As I moved to the next table, Sophie approached with an expression that instantly put me on alert. "Chef," she said quietly, "there's a situation at the bar you should know about." I followed her gaze to the elegant copper and marble bar that anchored the west wall of the restaurant. Even in profile, I recognized Rebecca instantly. She sat perched on a bar stool, her posture rigid as she sipped what appeared to be her second martini, judging by the empty glass beside her. She hadn't noticed me yet, her attention fixed on her phone. "How long has she been here?" I asked Sophie, maintaining my professional smile while processing this unexpected development. "About 20 minutes. She didn't have a reservation, just asked for a seat at the bar." Sophie hesitated. "Should I have the manager ask her to leave?" I considered this briefly before shaking my head. "No need. I'll handle it." As I approached the bar, I caught Miguel, our head bartender, watching Rebecca with the wary expression of someone serving a guest who might already be one drink past her limit. When he spotted me, relief washed over his face. "Chef," he greeted me, subtly tilting his head toward Rebecca. My appearance finally caught her attention. She turned slowly on her stool, martini glass suspended halfway to her lips. Unlike our brief interaction on opening night, there was no pretense of politeness in her expression now. Her eyes, slightly unfocused, assessed me with naked resentment. "Claire," she said, attempting a smile that came across as more of a grimace, "your bartender makes an excellent dirty martini, almost makes up for the 2-month wait to get a proper reservation." "Rebecca," I acknowledged with professional courtesy. "I wasn't aware you had tried to make a reservation." She laughed, a sharp sound that caused nearby diners to glance our way. "Oh, I tried. Mark tried. Apparently being the chef's almost ex-husband doesn't get you any special treatment." I maintained my composure, aware of the attention we were attracting. "The reservation system is handled by our front-of-house manager. I don't involve myself in that process." "Of course not," she replied, her voice carrying an edge. "You're too busy becoming a celebrity chef. Your face is everywhere these days." Miguel caught my eye, silently asking if he should intervene. I gave him an almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Rebecca, is everything all right?" I asked, genuinely curious about what had brought her here alone. "Where's Mark tonight?" Something flashed across her face. Pain, anger, or some combination of both. "That's a fascinating question," she said, taking another sip of her martini. "One I've been asking myself for the past few weeks. Where is Mark indeed?" Understanding dawned slowly. The tension in her posture, the solitary drinking, the barely contained hostility, these weren't just about me or my success. "I take it things aren't going well between you two," I said carefully, signaling Miguel to bring a glass of water. Rebecca's polished veneer cracked further. "You could say that. Turns out I'm just the latest in a pattern. Leave one woman, find another, repeat when bored." She swirled the olive in her drink. "Though I think you've thoroughly disrupted his usual recovery routine." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. Despite everything, I wouldn't wish the pain of Mark's betrayal on anyone, not even the woman he'd left me for. Are you? She challenged, her eyes suddenly sharp. Because from where I'm sitting, this all looks like an elaborate revenge scenario. The successful restaurants, the magazine features, the new look. She gestured vaguely toward my chef's coat. He can't stop talking about you, you know. Claire's new restaurant, Claire's write-up in the Tribune, Claire's incredible transformation. Miguel discreetly placed a glass of water near her elbow, which she ignored. This isn't about revenge, Rebecca, I said quietly. Or about Mark at all. This is about finally pursuing what I always wanted, but put aside for my marriage. She studied me for a long moment, searching for insincerity. Finding none, she deflated slightly. Well, it's working anyway. The revenge part. He's obsessed with getting you back. An uncomfortable silence settled between us. Around the restaurant, conversations continued. Servers delivered exquisite plates of food, and the sommelier guided a couple through wine pairings. All elements of the world I'd created continuing in perfect harmony despite this discordant encounter. I should go, Rebecca finally said, reaching for her purse. This was impulsive. Have you eaten? I asked, surprising both of us with the question. She blinked, momentarily thrown by the shift. No, Let me have the kitchen prepare something. For you. I turned to Miguel. Please move, Ms. I realized I didn't know her last name. Davidson, she supplied, looking equally surprised by this turn of events. Please move Ms. Davidson to table 14 and bring her a selection of our small plates. I returned my attention to Rebecca. The roasted beet salad with goat cheese mousse is particularly good tonight. Confusion replaced the hostility in her expression. Why would you do that? After everything? I considered my answer carefully. Because good food has power beyond judgment or grudges. It nurtures regardless of circumstance. I signaled to Lucas, one of our best servers. Lucas will take care of you. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on the kitchen. As I walked away, I heard Rebecca call after me. He's going to keep trying, you know. Mark doesn't like losing things he suddenly realizes are valuable. I paused but didn't turn around. I'm not a thing to be lost or claimed, Rebecca. I never was. That was always his fundamental misunderstanding. In the controlled chaos of the kitchen, I found my center again. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of perfectly seared scallops, the synchronized dance of my culinary team. These elements grounded me in the present rather than the complicated past that had just perched at my bar. Chef, called my pastry chef, Daniel. The soufflé special is ready for your approval. I inspected the perfect rise of the chocolate creation, its delicate crust concealing the molten interior. Beautiful work. Send 2 to table 14 with my compliments. Table 14? Daniel raised an eyebrow. Isn't that where you seated? Yes, I confirmed. Sometimes the best response to difficulty is unexpected generosity. An hour later, as I supervised the plating of entrees for a large party, Sophie appeared at my side. Rebecca's leaving, she said quietly. I thought you'd want to know. Through the kitchen's service window, I watched as Rebecca gathered her things, her demeanor notably calmer than when she'd arrived. As she stood to leave, she did something unexpected. She looked directly toward the kitchen and inclined her head in a gesture that wasn't quite a thank you but acknowledged something had shifted between us. After she departed, I found a business card left on the table beside a generous tip. On the back, a hastily scrawled note. The food was extraordinary. I understand him better now, both why he left and why he wants to come back. But we both deserve more than being someone's second choice. R. The card joined the collection of mementos in my office, newspaper clippings, food magazine features, and the key to my first restaurant, physical reminders of this unexpected journey. Rebecca's appearance tonight hadn't been the confrontation I might have expected months ago, but something more complex. a reluctant passing of understanding between two women who had occupied different roles in the same man's story. My phone chimed with a text from James. Ember and Vine final inspection passed. We're clear for opening next week. Congratulations, partner. The momentum continued, carrying me further from the life I'd had with Mark and deeper into the one I was creating. On my own terms, whatever his regrets, whatever his renewed interest in what he'd discarded, these were becoming increasingly distant concerns, growing fainter with each new achievement, each new restaurant, each new day lived fully in pursuit of my own vision, rather than supporting his. As service wound down that evening, I gathered my team for our nightly debrief. Looking at their expectant faces, some I'd handpicked from culinary school, others experienced veterans who'd chosen to join my rising star, I felt a surge of responsibility that transcended any lingering emotions about Mark or Rebecca. Tonight was exceptional, I told them, pride evident in my voice. 3 weeks of consecutive perfect service. You've all contributed to building something remarkable here. Their responding smiles reminded me of the family I'd created in this kitchen. One, built on mutual respect, shared passion, and recognition of individual talents. Nothing like the lonely isolation I'd experienced in my marriage, where my abilities were minimized rather than celebrated. Whatever storm Mark was brewing in his quest to re-enter my life would have to contend with the fortress of purpose I'd built, not just around me, but with and through the people who now believed in my vision as much as I did. The early morning light filtered through the windows of my private test kitchen, a converted warehouse space where I developed new recipes. Away from the bustling activity of my restaurants, this sanctuary of stainless steel and culinary innovation had become my favorite retreat, a place where I could experiment without interruption, pushing boundaries and refining techniques that would eventually appear on my menus. Today I was testing dessert concepts for Ember and Vine's opening next week. 6 variations of olive oil cake were lined up on the marble counter, each with subtle differences in texture, sweetness, and accompanying elements. Beside them, my grandmother's worn recipe journal lay open, its pages spotted with ingredients from decades of use. I ran my finger along her handwritten notes, smiling at the familiar script. The secret is in patience, she'd written in the margin. Let the oil emulsify slowly without rushing. My grandmother had been my first culinary mentor, though she'd never set foot in a professional kitchen. In her humble farmhouse, she'd created magic from simple ingredients, teaching me to respect the process and trust my instincts. When I married Mark, her journal had been the only possession I'd insisted on displaying in our otherwise perfectly decorated home. He'd eventually relegated it to a kitchen drawer, calling it too rustic for our contemporary aesthetic. As I reached for the micro zester to add a hint of lemon zest to my next iteration, the familiar weight of the tool triggered an unexpected cascade of memories. It was identical to the one I'd purchased 5 years ago, the catalyst for what I now recognized as the beginning of the end of my marriage. 5 years earlier. $200 for a kitchen gadget? Mark's voice had carried that particular tone he reserved for what he considered my domestic frivolities. Claire, that's ridiculous. I'd stood in our kitchen, still buoyant from the specialized cooking class I'd attended that afternoon, my first small act of culinary rebellion after years of suppressing my passion to focus on being a corporate wife. It's not just a gadget. Mark, it's a professional-grade micro zester. The instructor said it makes all the difference when preparing citrus-infused dishes. I'd held the sleek tool like a precious artifact, already imagining the possibilities it would unlock. Mark had sighed, loosening his tie after a long day at Carlton Financial. $200 to scrape lemons. Meanwhile, I just closed a $20 million account that will actually contribute to our future. The comparison had been deliberate, reinforcing the hierarchy he'd established in our marriage. His career was important, necessary, valuable. My culinary pursuits were expensive hobbies, indulgences he tolerated rather than supported. I used my personal spending budget, I'd said quietly. already feeling the joy of my purchase diminishing under his scrutiny. It didn't come from our joint account. He'd softened then, coming to put his arm around me in a gesture that felt more like ownership than affection. I know you enjoy your little cooking projects, honey. I just worry about you wasting money on professional equipment when you're never going to actually use it professionally. What if I wanted to? The question had escaped before I could contain it, a small rebellion voicing itself after years of careful self-censorship. Mark had laughed, the sound containing no malice but something perhaps worse, complete dismissal. Claire, be serious. You've never worked in a restaurant. You have no formal training. The culinary world is brutally competitive. He'd kissed my forehead, the gesture unconsciously patronizing. I love your cooking, but let's be realistic about your prospects. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, I'd slipped back to the kitchen and used my new micro zester to prepare lemon-infused shortbread cookies, working silently in the darkness. With each perfect curl of zest, I'd felt something crystallizing inside me. Not yet determination, but the quiet recognition of how thoroughly my dreams had been contained. Present day, I blinked away the memory, returning to my test kitchen. The microzester in my hand was now just one of dozens of professional tools I use daily, all purchased without justification or apology. I finished adding the precise amount of lemon zest to the olive oil batter, the muscle memory of thousands of such movements guiding my hands. My phone chimed with an incoming email, breaking my reverie. I wiped my hands on a towel before checking the message. It was from Richard, my attorney. The subject line read simply, "Update on divorce proceedings." I opened it with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After months of delays and excuses, had Mark finally signed the papers? "Claire," the email began, "Mr. Winters has proposed new terms for the divorce settlement. He's offering to relinquish all claims to your restaurant businesses in exchange for a face-to-face meeting to discuss reconciliation." His attorney emphasized that he's not making this contingent on any particular outcome of said meeting, just the opportunity to speak with you directly. I set the phone down, a complex wave of emotions washing over me. The practical side of me recognized the benefit. A clean break, no potential future claims on the empire I was building. The emotional side remembered all too clearly the subtle manipulations that had characterized our 15 years together. The olive oil cake momentarily forgotten, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. The city sprawled before me, its skyline including the building where I'd lived with Mark in a beautiful cage of his making. From this distance, it looked small, containable, much like the influence he now held over my life compared to months ago. My phone rang, James calling, probably about Ember and Vine's imminent opening. "I just heard from Richard," he said without preamble when I answered. "Mark's new proposal." "News travels fast," I commented, unsurprised that my business partner was already aware of the development. "What's your take?" "Legally, it's a clean solution," James replied, his background in business law evident in his assessment. "But Claire, you don't need to meet with him to secure your business interests. We have enough documentation of your intellectual property and creative control to protect everything you've built." "I know," I said quietly, watching a boat navigate the currents below. "But part of me thinks there's something powerful in facing him directly, not as the woman who left our apartment in tears 3 months ago, but as the person I've become since then." "That's your decision," James said, his tone softening. "Just remember you don't owe him closure or explanation. Whatever you decide, the restaurants are secure." After we hung up, I returned to my olive oil cakes, now cooled enough for tasting. Methodically, I sampled each variation, making notes on texture, flavor balance, and visual appeal. The discipline of professional assessment centered me, a reminder of how much I'd learned in the months since Mark's departure. The third variation was perfect, light yet substantial, with hints of lemon and rosemary complementing the fruity olive oil. I photographed it for the recipe documentation, already envisioning it paired with the house-made limoncello we'd been developing for Ember and Vine. As I cleaned my workstation with the focused precision I demanded of my kitchen staff, another memory surfaced. Not of Mark this time, but of my grandmother. Claire, she'd told me once while teaching me to make her famous peach pie, cooking is about transformation. Taking something simple, applying heat and time and attention, and creating something entirely new. People can transform the same way, if they're brave enough to endure the process. At the time, I thought she was simply talking about recipes. Now, I recognize the deeper wisdom in her words, how my own transformation had required walking through fire, experiencing pain, and emerging reconstituted into something stronger and more authentic. My phone chimed again with a text from Eliza. Reminder, final menu tasting for Ember and Vine at 3 p.m. Full team will be present. I glanced at my watch, surprised by how the morning had slipped away. Wrapping the perfect olive oil cake securely, I gathered my notes and prepared to leave the test kitchen. As I reached the door, I paused, looking back at the space that had become symbolic of my independence. A place where I created without justification or apology. The contrast with my former life was stark and illuminating. For years, I'd filtered my passions through Mark's expectations, seeking his approval for pursuits that required none. The realization made me wonder what else I might have accomplished had I freed myself sooner from the constraints of his limited vision for my life. When I stepped outside, the September air carried a hint of autumn, a transitional season appropriate for my current circumstances. I handed the wrapped cake to Thomas, my driver, who had become accustomed to transporting culinary experiments between my various restaurants. To Ember and Vine, I instructed, settling into the back seat. We're finalizing the opening menu today. As the car pulled away from the converted warehouse, I made a decision. I would meet with Mark, not from obligation or lingering attachment, but to fully close the chapter he represented in my life. Whatever closure he sought would be secondary to the closure I would claim for myself. A clear-eyed acknowledgement of both what was lost and what was gained in the dissolution of our marriage. I composed a brief response to Richard. I agree to one meeting. Neutral location. 1 hour maximum. No commitments beyond listening to what he has to say. Then I turned my attention to the notes I'd prepared for the menu tasting, focusing on the future I was creating rather than the past that had triggered these reflections. Whatever Mark wanted to say, whatever explanations or apologies he might offer, they would be received by a woman who no longer needed his validation to understand her worth. The transformation was complete. The heat had been applied. The time had passed, and what emerged was entirely, authentically new. The elegant interior of Ember and Vine hummed with anticipation. 3 days before our official opening, we were hosting a private friends and family event, the final dress rehearsal before introducing our Mediterranean concept to the public. Copper lanterns cast a warm glow over the rustic tables, each adorned with sprigs of fresh herbs and hand-painted ceramics I'd commissioned from a local artist. The scent of wood-fired bread and roasting meats permeated the space, creating an atmosphere of comforting abundance. I surveyed the scene from near the open kitchen, mentally checking every detail against my exacting standards. The staff moved, with practiced precision, having trained intensively for 6 weeks to execute my vision. Executive Chef Marcus, whom I'd lured from a prestigious position in Barcelona, directed his team with quiet authority, his experienced eyes missing nothing. "Everything is perfect, Claire," James said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of the house-made vermouth we'd developed specifically for Ember and Vine. "The critics are already calling tomorrow's opening the culinary event of the season." I accepted the glass, allowing myself a moment of satisfaction. "The real test will be next week, once the initial excitement fades and we're judged solely on consistency and quality." James chuckled. "Always focusing 3 steps ahead. That's why we're building an empire while others struggle to maintain a single restaurant." His words, though complimentary, triggered an uncomfortable awareness of how similar they sounded to something Mark might have said. The constant positioning, the measuring of success against others' failures. I took a sip of vermouth, appreciating its complex botanical notes while silently acknowledging the parts of my former marriage that had shaped my current drive. "Claire!" A familiar voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to find Diane Peterson, my former next-door neighbor, approaching, with open arms. "This place is absolutely stunning." I embraced her warmly, genuinely pleased she had accepted my invitation. During my marriage to Mark, Diane had been one of the few neighbors who had treated me as more than just Mark's wife, showing genuine interest in my culinary experiments and encouraging me to pursue formal training. "Thank you for coming, Diane. It means a lot to have friends here who knew me before." The unspoken qualifier hung between us, before my marriage ended, before my professional rebirth, before my name became associated with culinary innovation, rather than corporate wife perfection. Diane squeezed my hand, understanding the layers in my statement. "I always knew you were destined for more than neighborhood dinner parties, though I still miss your legendary holiday brunches." We both laughed, remembering the elaborate spreads I'd created for our cul-de-sac neighbors while Mark networked, with the husbands, discussing investment strategies and golf handicaps. "Speaking of the old neighborhood," Diane lowered her voice slightly, "I ran into Mark at the farmer's market last weekend. He was buying ingredients and asking the vendors detailed questions about seasonal produce. It was unexpected." I kept my expression neutral, though the image of Mark, who had once mocked my obsession with fresh ingredients, navigating a farmer's market was indeed surprising. "People change, I suppose." "He asked about you?" Diane continued, watching my reaction carefully. "Whether we still kept in touch, if I'd been to your restaurants." "And what did you tell him?" I asked, more curious than concerned. "That you were thriving in ways that made perfect sense to anyone who really knew you." Her pointed emphasis suggested she had always seen more clearly than Mark what I was capable of creating. Our conversation was interrupted as Marcus approached, his chef's whites immaculate despite hours in the kitchen. "Chef Winters, we're ready." "To begin the special tasting menu whenever you give the word," I nodded, switching seamlessly back into professional mode. "Let's start in 5 minutes. Ensure the timing between courses is precisely as we rehearsed." As Marcus returned to the kitchen, Diane smiled wistfully. "I remember when you used to apologize for fussing over meal timing at our neighborhood gatherings. Mark would always cut you off mid-explanation, saying no one cared about the technical details of how you created the food." The memory crystallized instantly. A specific dinner party 6 years into our marriage. I had prepared an elaborate 5-course meal, timing each element meticulously. When a guest had asked about my technique for achieving the perfect crust on the beef Wellington, I'd begun explaining the importance of temperature control and resting periods. "Claire gets carried away with the cooking minutiae," Mark had interrupted, placing a proprietary hand on my shoulder. "The important thing is that it tastes good enough for amateur palates like ours, right, honey?" The dismissal had been delivered with a smile, framed as affectionate teasing rather than the undermining it actually was. I'd laughed along, swallowing my passion along with my carefully paired wine, relegating my knowledge to the category of trivial hobby rather than valuable expertise. "Chef, we're ready." Sophie's voice pulled me back to the present, to a world where my minutiae commanded respect rather than dismissal, where my timing was understood as the foundation of excellence rather than unnecessary obsession. I excused myself from Diane and moved to the center of the restaurant, where conversations quieted as guests sensed an announcement coming. "Welcome to Ember and Vine," I began, my voice confident and warm. "Tonight, we're sharing a preview of our journey through Mediterranean coastal cuisine, dishes that honor tradition while embracing innovation. Each course tells a story of place, ingredients, and the transformative power of fire and vine. As I spoke, I noticed a latecomer being quietly seated at a corner table. My breath caught momentarily. Mark's mother, Elizabeth Winters, elegant as ever in understated designer wear, her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon. She had not RSVP'd to my invitation, and her presence was as surprising as it was potentially complicated. Without missing a beat, I continued my introduction, explaining the philosophy behind our curated wine pairings and the significance of our wood-fired cooking techniques. Only when the first course was being served did I make my way to Elizabeth's table. "Elizabeth," I greeted her, genuinely pleased despite the unexpected nature of her appearance. During my marriage, she had been one of the few people in Mark's family who had shown genuine interest in my culinary ambitions, often requesting my recipes and defending my hobby when other family members dismissed it. "Claire, darling." She rose to embrace me, her familiar perfume evoking countless family holidays and formal dinners. I hope my late arrival wasn't disruptive. The invitation seemed to get lost in the mail, but when Diane mentioned it, I couldn't miss witnessing what you've created. The graceful fabrication, we both knew I hadn't sent her an invitation, uncertain of where her loyalties would lie after the separation, allowed us both to maintain dignity. "I'm delighted you're here. Let me make sure you're properly taken care of." With a discreet signal to our best server, I ensured Elizabeth would receive special attention throughout the evening. As I turned to leave, she gently caught my wrist. "Claire," she said, her voice lowered, "I want you to know that family is more than legal documents. What you've accomplished? It's extraordinary. And some of us have always seen your potential, even when others were blind to it." The unexpected support brought a lump to my throat. "Thank you, Elizabeth. That means more than you know." As the evening progressed, I circulated among the guests, accepting congratulations and explaining the inspirations behind various dishes. Through it all, I was acutely aware of Elizabeth's presence, a connection to my former life observing the manifestation of my new one. When the dessert course arrived, my perfected olive oil cake paired with house-made limoncello and candied herbs, I found myself back at Elizabeth's table as she took her first bite. "This," she declared, closing her eyes briefly to savor the experience, "is what you were trying to explain at that Christmas dinner 7 years ago. The one where Mark kept interrupting your description of olive oil's flavor profiles." The memory surfaced with vivid clarity, standing in Elizabeth's kitchen, attempting to share my enthusiasm for different regional olive oils, while Mark repeatedly cut me off, insisting oil is oil, and that no one could possibly taste the differences I was describing. "You remember that?" I asked, surprised by her specific recollection. "Of course I do." Her expression softened. "I also remember watching you retreat into yourself afterward, how you stopped sharing your knowledge even when asked directly. It was like watching someone slowly dim their own light." The observation was so accurate, so perceptive of the subtle erosion of self that had characterized my marriage, that I found myself momentarily speechless. Elizabeth continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Mark learned many things from his father. Some good, some less so. The need to be the authority in the room was unfortunately among the latter." In that moment, I glimpsed something I had never fully understood during my marriage, that perhaps Mark's dismissal of my culinary passion hadn't stemmed solely from disregard, but from his own insecurity, his inherited need to be the expert, in any room. "He's struggling, you know," Elizabeth said after a moment. "Not just with losing you, but with recognizing the role he played in that loss. It's a hard lesson, acknowledging that you contributed to the diminishment of someone you claim to love." I nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected glimpse into Mark's private reckoning. Before I could formulate a reply, James approached with the food critic from the Tribune, and the moment for personal reflection passed as I smoothly transitioned back into my role as chef and restaurateur. Later, As the event wound down and guests began to depart, Elizabeth found me near the kitchen. "I won't presume to advise you about your upcoming meeting with Mark," she said, surprising me with her knowledge of the scheduled conversation. "But I will say this. You've finally found your voice, Claire. Whatever happens, don't let anyone, including my son, convince you to lower its volume again." With a final embrace, she left, leaving me with a new perspective on the complex origins of my marital conflict, how patterns established years before had gradually narrowed my world until the only path to growth led away from the marriage itself. As the staff began the meticulous cleanup process, preparing for tomorrow's grand opening, I realized that the meeting with Mark they'd been approaching with such careful emotional fortification might offer insights beyond mere closure. Perhaps, in understanding the roots of his behavior, I might fully release any lingering doubts about my decision to prioritize my own flowering over the slow withering that had characterized our life together. The rain pelted against the windows of our suburban home, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the silence that had fallen between us. I stood in our kitchen, my domain as Mark often called it, clutching my phone with white knuckles, the screen still illuminated with messages never meant for my eyes. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice eerily calm despite the earthquake, reshaping my internal landscape. Mark stood in the doorway, his suit jacket discarded but tie still perfectly knotted, as though maintaining some semblance of professional composure might somehow mitigate what was happening. He had arrived home 20 minutes earlier to find me sitting motionless at our kitchen island, phone in hand, his phone, which he'd accidentally left behind that morning in his rush to reach an early meeting. The notification had appeared while I was placing it on the charger, Rebecca with a heart emoji beside her name. One innocent glance at the preview had revealed words that instantly shattered 15 years of marriage. "Claire, we need to be rational about this," he said, his tone slipping into the same measured cadence he used when explaining financial concepts he considered beyond my grasp. "These things are rarely as simple as they appear." "How long, Mark?" I repeated, my voice gaining strength despite the hollow feeling spreading through my chest. He sighed, loosening his tie with practiced fingers. 6 months. But it's complicated. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of intimate dinners where he'd picked at my carefully prepared meals before claiming a late meeting called him back to the office. 6 months of declining physical affection explained away as stress or fatigue. 6 months during which I'd redoubled my efforts to be the supportive wife, even putting aside my application to Le Cordon Bleu's professional program after he'd pointed out the impracticality of such an endeavor at my age. "She's your secretary." The words tasted bitter, almost cliché in their predictability. Rebecca Davidson, 15 years my junior, who had started at Carlton Financial around the same time the distance between Mark and me had begun to grow. "Executive assistant," he corrected automatically, then winced at his own tone-deaf precision. I set the phone down on the marble countertop, the same expensive marble I'd argued against during our kitchen renovation, but had ultimately accepted, because Mark insisted it reflected our standard of living better than the butcher block I'd preferred for its practicality and warmth. "Are you in love with her?" The question emerged with surprising steadiness, as though asked by someone else using my voice. Mark's hesitation contained the answer before he spoke. "I think I could be," he finally said. "There's a connection, an understanding that developed over time. She sees me, Claire, my ambitions, my vision for the future." The unspoken contrast hung in the air between us. The implication that I no longer saw those things, or perhaps had never truly seen them at all. In that moment, standing in my meticulously organized kitchen surrounded by professional-grade appliances I'd selected to pursue my hobby, I recognized the fundamental misalignment that had always existed in our marriage. Mark wanted to be witnessed in his success, while I simply wanted to be allowed to create mine. "I've been trying to find the right time to talk about this," he continued, moving toward the expensive scotch we kept for special occasions. Obviously, this isn't how I wanted you to find out. I watched as he poured himself 2 fingers of amber, liquid, not offering me any, another small but telling oversight. So you were planning to tell me. How generous. His jaw tightened at my uncharacteristic sarcasm. In 15 years of marriage, I had rarely pushed back against his decisions, choosing harmony over conflict, accommodation over assertion. Claire, sarcasm doesn't suit you. Can we please discuss this rationally? Rational, I repeated, the word suddenly illuminating years of imbalance. Yes, let's be rational. Rational is your domain, isn't it? Emotions are messy and unpredictable, better suited to my creative temperament, as you like to call it. Mark took a measured sip of his scotch, his expression suggesting he was already calculating assets and liabilities, transitions and settlements. I've spoken with Rebecca about next steps. We both agree that a clean break is best for everyone involved. Next steps, I echoed, the corporate jargon so perfectly encapsulating his approach to dissolving our life together. You've already planned it all out. It's better this way, he said, his tone softening in what I recognized as his version of compassion. Prolonging the inevitable would only cause more pain. I've always admired your resilience, Claire, your ability to make beautiful dishes from whatever ingredients are available. You'll adapt to this change too. The casual confidence with which he described my future adjustment to his betrayal ignited something that had been smoldering beneath years of compromise. And what exactly do you envision for me in this clean break scenario, Mark? Quietly? Moving to a condo with an adequate kitchen where I can continue my little cooking projects while you build a new life with a woman half my age? He had the decency to look uncomfortable, though whether from my accuracy or my unusual directness wasn't clear. I've drafted a generous settlement proposal. The house would need to be sold, of course, but you'd have enough to establish yourself, comfortably. Maybe even open that small catering business you've talked about occasionally. The condescension in his voice as he mentioned my culinary ambitions reduced to a small catering business when I'd spoken of restaurants and culinary. Innovation crystallized 15 years of similar dismissals. Every cooking class I'd taken, every technique I'd mastered, every industry connection I'd cultivated had been treated as an adorable diversion rather than serious professional development. When are you leaving? I asked, the practical question, emerging from some self-protective instinct that recognized the marriage was already over, had perhaps been over long before Rebecca entered the picture. Mark straightened, seemingly relieved by my pivot to logistics. I've found a temporary apartment downtown. I thought I might pack some essentials tonight, give you some space to process. How considerate, I murmured, though the barb lacked energy as the full weight of what was happening began to settle around me. 15 years of shared history, dissolved by a text message and a 10-minute conversation. As Mark moved toward the stairs to pack his things, he paused, looking back at me with an expression that mixed pity with something like concern. You'll be fine, Claire. You've always been good at making yourself useful and keeping busy. But this separation might be an opportunity to think realistically about your future. The culinary world is brutally competitive, and you're starting rather late. Perhaps focusing on something more attainable would be wiser. The casual cruelty of his parting advice, delivered I was certain with genuine belief he was being helpful, struck deeper than the infidelity itself. In one sentence, he had summarized the fundamental disregard that had characterized his view of my ambitions throughout our marriage. Good luck with Rebecca, I said quietly. I hope she lives up to whatever fantasy you've constructed around her. 2 hours later, after Mark had packed a suitcase and left with promises to arrange for the rest of his things, I stood alone in our expansive kitchen. The rain had stopped, and a strange stillness pervaded the house, a silence that seemed to ask what would fill it now. I opened the drawer where I kept my collection of culinary school brochures and restaurant business plans, materials I'd gathered, secretly over years while outwardly playing the role of corporate wife. Among them was the acceptance letter from Le Cordon Bleu's professional program, the opportunity I'd declined 3 months ago after Mark had pointed out how impractical it would be to pursue such training at this stage in life. With trembling fingers, I reached for my laptop and composed a brief email to the admissions office, inquiring whether my deferred acceptance might still be valid. The simple act of typing those words, of reaching toward my own ambition without filtering it through Mark's expectations, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As I pressed send, my phone lit up with a text from Mark. Left contact information for my lawyer on the desk. He'll be in touch about settlement details. I truly do wish you the best, Claire. You'll never be truly successful in the culinary world without proper training and connections, but perhaps this change will help you find a new path that suits your actual talents. Either way, I wish you happiness. The message, intended as conciliatory, instead illuminated the profound misunderstanding that had characterized our entire relationship. Even in separation, he couldn't see me clearly, couldn't recognize that what he perceived as limitations were simply potentials he had helped suppress. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. Business Plan, Claire Winter's Culinary Ventures. The title felt presumptuous, even ridiculous given my complete lack of professional experience. Yet, something about seeing my name associated with the word culinary in a professional context felt like the first honest breath after 15 years of careful, accommodating half-breathing. My phone chimed again. Not Mark this time, but an almost immediate response from Le Cordon Bleu. We would be delighted to reactivate your application. Your impressive preliminary assessments suggest you would be an outstanding addition to our program. Please call to discuss expedited enrollment options. For the first time since discovering the text messages that morning, tears filled my eyes. Not tears of loss or betrayal, but of recognition. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of my marriage hadn't been its end, but the years spent dimming my own light to avoid outshining someone who had never truly seen its potential in the first place. The empty apartment echoed with each footstep as I walked through its sparse rooms. 1 month after Mark's departure, I had sold our suburban home, accepting a quick below-market offer to expedite my freedom from the mortgage we'd shared. The proceeds, minus Mark's portion as stipulated in our preliminary separation agreement, had provided enough for a security deposit on this modest one-bedroom and the first term's tuition at Le Cordon Bleu. Gone were the designer furniture pieces and curated art collection that had filled our marital home. In their place stood a second-hand couch, a basic table with mismatched chairs, and a bed that occupied most of the small bedroom. The only area that didn't feel like a downgrade was the kitchen, where I'd invested in maintaining professional grade appliances, unwilling to compromise on the tools of what I now firmly considered my future profession. I set down the grocery bags on the laminate countertop, unpacking ingredients for the evening's practice dishes. Tomorrow would be my first practical exam at culinary school, and despite my instructor's praise for my technical skills, anxiety gnawed at my confidence. At 42, I was the oldest student in the professional program by nearly 15 years, a fact my classmates acknowledged with either awkward deference or barely concealed skepticism. The weight of starting over pressed down on me as I mechanically organized my mise en place. Classical French cooking techniques required precision and discipline, qualities I'd developed in my home kitchen, but now had to demonstrate under critical professional scrutiny. My hands, which had executed these same movements countless times for appreciative dinner guests, now trembled slightly as I considered the judgment awaiting me. My phone buzzed with an incoming email, momentarily distracting me from my spiraling thoughts. The notification preview showed the sender, Mark's attorney, again. Third message this week, each more insistent than the last, all requesting I reconsider the division of assets in light of my unlikely career prospects and realistic future, earnings potential. I deleted it without reading further, too emotionally depleted to engage with yet another communication designed to diminish my ambitions. Since leaving, Mark had pivoted from dismissive to actively undermining, his initial promises of a generous settlement evolving into a strategy that seemed designed to financially starve my culinary dreams into submission. The small apartment suddenly felt suffocating. I moved to open a window, seeking fresh air to clear the fog of doubt that had been my constant companion since the separation. As I gazed out at the unremarkable view, a parking lot, and the brick wall of the adjacent building, the stark contrast with the carefully landscaped garden I'd tended for 15 years struck me with unexpected force. This was what starting over looked like at 42. Not the glamorous reinvention portrayed in inspirational stories, but this. Standing alone in a rented apartment, surrounded by secondhand furniture, preparing practice dishes that would be evaluated and quite possibly found wanting by instructors, young enough to be my children. The practical reality of my situation crashed over me in waves. I had traded financial security for a chance at professional fulfillment that statistically few achieved, especially those beginning as late as I was. The culinary industry was notoriously brutal: low pay, punishing hours, physical demands that wore down even the youngest bodies. What made me think I could succeed where so many others failed? Mark's voice seemed to whisper from every corner of the sparse apartment. You'll never be truly successful in the culinary world without proper training and connections. The cruel irony was that I was now pursuing exactly that training. But at what cost? My savings dwindled with each passing week, the divorce proceedings dragged on without resolution, and the path from student to successful chef stretched before me like an impossible mountain to scale. I picked up a knife and began, dicing onions with mechanical precision, the familiar motion offering minimal comfort. The sharp aroma released by each cut triggered another memory. Mark wrinkling his nose at the smell permeating our house after one of my experimental cooking sessions, his casual comment about keeping my hobby contained so it didn't disrupt the normal functioning of our home. Tears blurred my vision, ostensibly from the onions but in reality from the overwhelming doubt that had chosen this moment to fully manifest. What if he was right? What if this pursuit was nothing more than an extended tantrum against the limitations of my former life, doomed to collapse under the weight of financial reality and professional barriers? My phone rang, startling me from my spiral. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize. Hello? I answered, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. Claire Winters? An unfamiliar male voice responded. This is James Collins. We met briefly at the charity cooking event last fall. I was hoping to discuss a potential opportunity with you. I struggled to place the name until it clicked. James Collins, the restaurant investor who had praised my canapes at the fundraiser Mark had reluctantly attended with me. Yes, of course, I remember. Excellent. I've been following your journey since then. Your acceptance to Le Cordon Bleu's professional program was noted in their alumni newsletter. Quite impressive for a first-time applicant. The compliment, delivered with matter-of-fact confidence rather than condescension, momentarily lifted the fog of self-doubt. Thank you. It's been an adjustment. I can imagine, he replied, his tone suggesting genuine understanding. Listen, I'll get right to the point. I'm developing a new restaurant concept focused on elevated home-style cuisine with modern techniques, essentially bridging the gap between comforting familiarity and innovative gastronomy. Your approach at that charity event struck exactly that balance. I'm wondering if you might be interested in discussing a potential collaboration once you complete your program. The knife I'd been holding clattered to the countertop. A collaboration? But I'm just starting my formal training. I have no restaurant experience. Experience comes in many forms, James replied, his voice carrying none of the dismissal I'd grown accustomed to when discussing my culinary ambitions. Your technical skills are already impressive, and formal training will only enhance them. But what caught my attention was your perspective. Your ability to reimagine traditional dishes while maintaining their emotional resonance. That can't be taught in any culinary program. As he continued outlining his vision for the restaurant concept, I sank onto one of the mismatched kitchen chairs, the weight of my earlier despair temporarily lifted by this unexpected recognition. Here was someone who had seen potential in my work without qualification or condescension, who spoke of my culinary perspective as an asset rather than an indulgence. This would be, of course, a partnership that respects your creative control, James concluded. I provide the business infrastructure and investment. You develop the culinary identity. Equal voices in the venture. Equal voices. The phrase resonated through my small kitchen, highlighting by contrast the unequal partnership that had characterized my marriage. Mark had never considered my input equal to his, not in financial decisions, not in lifestyle choices, and certainly not in validating my professional aspirations. I'm still early in my program, I said cautiously, unwilling to grasp too eagerly at what seemed too perfect an opportunity. And in the middle of divorce proceedings that are becoming complicated. I understand timing concerns, James replied smoothly. This would be a development process over the next 6 to 8 months, coinciding with the completion of your program. As for the divorce, I have excellent legal resources if you need recommendations. Financial entanglements shouldn't prevent you from planning your professional future. After arranging to meet for a proper discussion the following week, I hung up and stared at the half-prepared ingredients on my counter. The call had arrived at my lowest moment, when doubt had nearly crushed my resolve, when Mark's dismissive assessment of my potential seemed most credible in the face of my reduced circumstances. I returned to my preparation with renewed focus, the mechanical movements now infused with purpose beyond tomorrow's exam. Each precise cut, each carefully measured ingredient, became an act of defiance against the limitations that had been placed upon me by Mark, by social expectations, and most damagingly, by my own internalized doubts. As I plated the practice dish, a deconstructed coq au vin that maintained the soul of the classic while reimagining its presentation, I studied the result with newly critical eyes. Not perfect, but promising. Like me, it existed in a state of becoming, no longer bound by traditional constraints, but not yet fully realized in its new form. I photographed the dish from several angles, then impulsively sent the best image to James Collins with a brief message. A preview of my perspective. Looking forward to our discussion. His response came almost immediately. Exactly what I envisioned. This is just the beginning. Just the beginning. The phrase echoed Mark's dismissive text from the night he'd left, yet carried precisely the opposite meaning. Where he had seen an ending of my relevance, my potential, my chance at meaningful creation, James saw inception. I cleaned my small kitchen with the same precision I'd applied to cooking, each surface wiped to immaculate readiness for tomorrow's practice. The apartment remained modest, my finances still precarious, the divorce still unresolved. Yet something fundamental had shifted in those 4 words. Just the beginning. In the bedroom, I opened my laptop to review my course materials. One final time before sleeping. An email notification appeared, another message from Mark's lawyer, this one with a subject line that cut through my renewed determination. Urgent. Financial disclosure concerns. The message detailed allegations that I had concealed potential business opportunities during our initial settlement discussions, citing reliable information about pending restaurant ventures that should factor into the financial arrangements. The source of this information wasn't specified, but the timing, mere hours after James's call, suggested a disturbing level of monitoring or coincidence. I closed the laptop, my momentary confidence once again tinged with anxiety. The path, Forward remained steep and uncertain, with obstacles I was only beginning to understand. Yet for the first time since discovering those text messages in our kitchen, I recognized that the true betrayal hadn't been Mark's infidelity, but the years spent accepting his limited vision of my potential as the definitive assessment of my worth. Tomorrow's culinary exam was just one step on a journey that suddenly stretched before me with both daunting challenges and unexpected possibilities. Whatever Mark or his lawyers might do to impede my progress, they could no longer control how I valued my own capabilities. That power, at least, I had reclaimed from the wreckage of our marriage. The knife moved with fluid precision as I julienned the carrot into perfect, matchstick-thin strips. Around me, my fellow culinary students, most at least 15 years, my junior, worked with varying degrees of confidence and skill. Chef Bernard, our French instructor, prowled the classroom kitchen like a meticulous predator, his critical gaze missing nothing. "Too thick, Mr. Alvarez," he commented to the young man beside me. "Again, please. Consistency is everything." I kept my focus on my own station, completing the mirepoix for the sauce we were preparing. After 6 weeks at Le Cordon Bleu, I'd learned that drawing attention in Chef Bernard's class was rarely positive. His standards were exacting, his criticism cutting, and his praise virtually non-existent. "Ms. Winters." His voice directly behind me sent a jolt through my nervous system, though my knife never faltered. "Your technique." I braced myself for correction, mentally reviewing my hand position and cutting angle. "Show the others." The instruction came without embellishment, but contained something I hadn't yet heard in his voice. Approval. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me as Chef Bernard directed the class's attention to my workstation. "Observe Ms. Winters' precision, the consistency of each piece, the economy of movement. This is what professional kitchens demand." The unexpected praise warmed me even as I demonstrated the technique with calm focus. After class, as I meticulously cleaned my station, Chef Bernard approached again. "You have been cooking for many years," he stated rather than asked, his French accent more pronounced in private conversation. "Yes, chef, though never professionally." He nodded thoughtfully. "It shows in your hands. They have memory that the young ones lack." He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic directness. "I received a call from James Collins yesterday." I looked up in surprise. "About me?" "He is assembling a team for a new restaurant concept. He asked about your progress." Chef Bernard's expression remained impassive. "I told him you possess technical skills superior to many who have worked in professional kitchens for years." Small swell of pride rose within me, though I carefully maintained my composed exterior. "Thank you, chef. That's very generous." "It is not generosity, Ms. Winters. It is assessment." He gathered his knives with methodical care. "The culinary world is difficult, competitive, exhausting, often cruel, especially to women. Especially to those beginning later in life." His eyes met mine directly. "You will face resistance and skepticism at every turn." I absorbed his words, recognizing the truth in them. "I'm aware of the challenges, chef." "Are you?" Something in his tone suggested deeper knowledge. "James mentioned your personal situation. A divorce, yes? From someone who did not support your culinary ambitions?" The personal question from my normally reserved instructor caught me off guard. "Yes, my husband, my ex-husband. He saw cooking as a hobby, not a viable career path." Chef Bernard nodded, as though confirming something he'd already deduced. "This is common. Many great chefs, particularly women, have had to choose between their passion and relationships that diminish it." He secured his knife roll with practiced movements. "The question becomes, Ms. Winters, what will you do with this freedom you have purchased at such cost?" The question lingered in my mind as I left campus that evening, making my way to the small bistro where James Collins had suggested we meet. 6 weeks into my culinary program, and already both my instructor and a successful restaurateur saw potential that Mark had dismissed throughout our marriage. The validation should have been wholly encouraging, yet doubt still clung to me like a persistent shadow. The bistro was quietly elegant, nestled on a side street away from the trendier restaurant rows. James was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, his attention focused on the portfolio spread before him. Claire. He stood to greet me, his handshake firm and professional. Thank you for making time during what must be an incredibly busy period. Thank you for reaching out, I replied, settling into the chair across from him. It was unexpected. The server approached with water and menus, but James waved away the latter. Chef Marcel knows we're here. He's preparing a tasting of his spring menu for us, if that's acceptable. I nodded, appreciating both the gesture and the opportunity to experience another chef's seasonal vision. As we waited for the first course, James turned the conversation to my training. Bernard speaks very highly of your technical proficiency, he began. Says you have the hands of a natural chef trapped in the body of a home cook. I laughed, despite myself. That sounds like Chef Bernard's particular brand of compliment. Indeed. James smiled. But he doesn't offer praise lightly, so I consider it significant. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me what drew you to professional training after years of cooking at home. The question was asked with genuine curiosity, rather than the thinly veiled skepticism I'd encountered from others. As the first course arrived, a delicate spring pea velouté with mint oil and crab, I found myself explaining my lifelong passion for cooking and the gradual suppression of my professional ambitions during my marriage. So when Mark left, I concluded. It was devastating, but also clarifying. Suddenly, there was no one telling me what was practical or realistic. No one's expectations to manage but my own. James nodded thoughtfully. Freedom through abandonment. Painful, but potentially transformative. Exactly, I agreed, surprised by his perceptiveness. Though the transformation part is still very much in progress. Between school, the ongoing divorce proceedings, and financial concerns, it's hard to see the path forward clearly. That's where I believe I can help, James replied, gesturing for the server to proceed with the next course. I've been developing a restaurant concept that aligns perfectly with your culinary perspective. A place that bridges classical technique with intuitive, emotionally resonant cooking. As he outlined his vision, a restaurant that would showcase seasonal ingredients through both traditional and innovative preparations, I felt a growing sense of alignment with my own culinary philosophy. Each course that arrived from the kitchen provided a tactile backdrop to our conversation, the chef's executions prompting discussions about technique, presentation, and emotional impact. The question is, James said as dessert, a deconstructed lemon tart was served. Are you ready to commit to this path? Not just culinary school, but becoming the executive chef of a significant new restaurant? The directness of the question momentarily took my breath away. I'm still early in my training, I hedged, though excitement fluttered beneath my cautious response. And I have no professional kitchen experience. Experience can be acquired, James countered. Vision and palate are much harder to develop. You already possess both. He slid a folder across the table. This is my formal proposal. Take time to review it. Discuss it with your attorney if you wish. But know that I'm prepared to move forward as soon as you're ready. I opened the folder to find a detailed business plan for a restaurant tentatively named Maison, along with financial projections, proposed terms of partnership, and a timeline that aligned with the completion of my culinary program. This is overwhelming, I admitted, scanning the document that treated my culinary direction as the centerpiece of a significant business venture. Sometimes the universe clears a path just when we need it most, James replied. The question is whether we have the courage to walk it. As I left the bistro that evening, portfolio tucked securely under my arm, I felt something crystallizing within me. A certainty that had been absent in the weeks of doubt and financial stress following Mark's departure. The path James offered aligned so perfectly with my long-suppressed dreams that it seemed almost surreal, yet the detailed business plan grounded it in practical reality. In my small apartment, I spread the documents across my table, reviewing each page with careful attention. Where Mark had seen an impractical hobby, James recognized marketable talent. Where my ex-husband had insisted on limitations, this virtual stranger perceived possibilities worth significant investment. The contrast illuminated the fundamental flaw in my marriage. I had allowed someone else's limited vision of me to define my aspirations and capabilities. Now, faced with an opportunity that recognized my true potential, I had a choice: continue cautiously rebuilding or embrace a bold path forward that aligned with my deepest ambitions. I reached for my phone and composed a text to James. "I'm in. Let's create something extraordinary." His response came almost immediately. "Welcome to the beginning of your real culinary career, Chef Winters." Chef Winters. The title sent a thrill of recognition through me, not just of what I might become, but of what I had always been beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation. The spark that had been nearly extinguished by years of subtle undermining now flamed into determined purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, completing my training, navigating the divorce, building a restaurant from concept to reality, I would face them not as Mark's discarded wife, but as Chef Claire Winters. The transformation had begun. The key to a successful restaurant launch isn't just the food, it's the story, James explained, sketching a rough diagram on the whiteboard that dominated his office wall. Every decision, from menu to decor to service style, must reinforce that narrative. I nodded, absorbing this perspective that went far beyond my culinary training. 3 months into our partnership, these strategy sessions had become a vital complement to my technical education at Le Cordon Bleu. While Chef Bernard taught me the classical foundations of French cuisine, James was educating me on the business realities of the restaurant industry. "What's our story then?" I asked, studying the mind map he was creating. "What makes Maison Sauvage different from every other fine dining restaurant in the city?" James capped his marker and turned to face me. "That's where you come in, Claire. The most compelling restaurant narratives are authentic extensions of the chef's personal journey." I considered this, thinking about my own path from dismissed home cook to culinary professional. "Transformation," I offered. "Taking familiar elements and elevating them through technique and imagination, revealing the extraordinary potential in what others might overlook." A smile spread across James's face. "Exactly. That's not just a concept. It's your lived experience. That authenticity will resonate with diners and critics alike." On the conference table between us lay architectural renderings of the space we'd leased. A former printing press with soaring ceilings, exposed brick, and industrial character. The renovation plans maintained these elements while introducing warmth through strategic lighting, natural materials, and an open kitchen design that would make the culinary process visible to diners. "The construction team says we're on schedule," James noted, shifting to practical matters. "We should be able to begin kitchen installation in 6 weeks, which aligns perfectly with the completion of your program." I flipped through my portfolio, reviewing the equipment specifications I'd researched obsessively. Each piece had been selected not just for functionality, but for how it would support the culinary narrative we were developing. The wood-fired oven, vintage copper cookware, and custom butcher block stations all reinforced our commitment to blending traditional techniques with modern sensibilities. "I've finalized the initial menu concept," I said, sliding a document across the table. "Seasonal, locally sourced ingredients prepared with classical French techniques, but presented with contemporary influences. Each dish tells a story of transformation. James reviewed the menu with the careful attention he brought to all aspects of our partnership. This is exceptional, Claire. Chef Bernard's influence is evident in the technical foundations, but your voice comes through clearly in the creative elements. Praise warmed me, reinforcing how different this professional relationship was from my marriage. Where Mark had dismissed my culinary innovations as unnecessary complications, James recognized them as the distinctive touches that would set our restaurant apart from competitors. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Marketing and public relations. Specifically, your personal story as part of our launch strategy." I tensed involuntarily. My personal story? "The journey from home cook to executive chef is compelling," James explained gently. "Especially given the circumstances that catalyzed your professional emergence. Food journalists love redemption narratives. The idea of publicly discussing Mark's betrayal and my subsequent transformation made me deeply uncomfortable. While I had embraced my new identity as Chef Claire Winters, I had shared the details of my divorce with very few people beyond James and Chef Bernard. "I understand your hesitation," James continued, reading my expression. "But consider how many others might be inspired by your story. People trapped in relationships that diminish their potential, afraid to pursue their true passions because someone has convinced them it's impractical or impossible." His words resonated more deeply than I wanted to admit. How many times during my marriage had I read inspirational stories about women reinventing themselves after personal setbacks? How many times had I thought, I wish I had their courage, never imagining I might one day be that person for someone else? "I'm not suggesting we lead with the divorce details," James clarified. "Simply that we acknowledge the journey from accomplished home cook to professional chef later in life. The personal catalyst can remain private while still honoring the transformation." I considered his suggestion carefully. "I need to think about how much I'm comfortable sharing. This is still very raw, and the divorce isn't even finalized." "Of course," James agreed immediately. "You control your narrative, Claire. I'm simply suggesting we consider how it might become a powerful element of our restaurant's identity." As our meeting concluded, I gathered my materials with a newfound awareness of how thoroughly my personal and professional identities had become intertwined. The restaurant concept we were developing, transformation through technique and vision, was essentially the story of my own emergence from Mark's shadow. Outside James's office building, I paused to check my phone and found an email from my attorney. "Settlement meeting scheduled," read the subject line. After months of delays and strategic obfuscation, Mark had finally agreed to meet with our respective lawyers to finalize the divorce terms. The timing seemed almost providential, an opportunity to close that chapter definitively before opening the restaurant that represented my new beginning. I texted my attorney to confirm my availability, then continued toward the culinary school for my afternoon classes. Chef Bernard was demonstrating advanced pastry techniques when I arrived, his movements precise and economical as he created delicate sugar decorations. I slipped into the back of the classroom, not wanting to interrupt, but he acknowledged me with a slight nod. "Ms. Winters will now demonstrate the technique for chocolate tempering," he announced after completing his presentation. "Her method achieved perfect crystallization during last week's assessment." As I moved to the front of the class, I was struck by how different this felt from just 6 months ago. Where I had once been hesitant and apologetic about my knowledge, I now stepped forward with quiet confidence, explaining the precise temperature control and agitation necessary for proper chocolate tempering. "The key is patience and attention," I concluded, demonstrating the testing method that confirmed proper crystallization. Rushed tempering leads to chocolate that's dull, soft, and prone to blooming. Proper technique reveals the chocolate's natural brilliance and structure. Chef Bernard nodded approvingly. "An excellent explanation. Note how Ms. Winters connects technical precision with the ingredient's potential. This is the mindset that separates true chefs from mere cooks. After class, as I gathered my tools, Chef Bernard approached my workstation. James Collins informed me that your restaurant concept is progressing well, he said, arranging his own implements with characteristic precision. Yes, chef. We're scheduled to open 3 months after graduation. Ambitious, he commented, though his tone suggested approval rather than criticism. And the divorce proceedings. His direct reference to my personal situation no longer surprised me. Over the months of training, Chef Bernard had become something of a mentor, his interest extending beyond my technical development to my overall transition into professional culinary life. Finally moving forward, I replied. Settlement meeting. Next week. He nodded thoughtfully. Closure is important. It allows full focus on the path ahead. He handed me a business card. My former sous chef is between positions. Excellent technical skills, good temperament under pressure. Consider her for your kitchen team. The recommendation represented a significant vote of confidence from my exacting instructor. Thank you, chef. I'll contact her immediately. As I left campus that evening, I found myself mentally rehearsing what I might say to Mark during our settlement meeting. For months, his lawyers had employed delaying tactics while he simultaneously attempted to arrange private conversations to discuss our situation. My refusal to engage outside legal channels had clearly frustrated his expectation that I would eventually capitulate to his terms out of financial necessity or emotional vulnerability. What he couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly my professional renaissance had reconstructed my sense of self-worth. The woman who had once accommodated his dismissal of her aspirations had been replaced by someone who recognized her value, not just in the culinary world, but in every aspect of life. In my apartment that evening, I reviewed the strategic plans James and I had developed: menu concepts, staffing structures, marketing timelines. Each element reflected careful consideration of both practical and creative concerns. A balanced approach that honored my culinary vision while establishing a sustainable business model. The contrast with Mark's dismissive assessment of my professional potential couldn't have been starker. Where he had seen limitation, James recognized opportunity. Where Mark had insisted on practicality defined by conventional paths, James valued the distinctive perspective my unconventional journey provided. My phone chimed with a text from James. Finalize the PR firm selection. They're excited about our concept and your culinary direction. Ready when you are to discuss how much of your story you're comfortable sharing. I studied the message, recognizing that my hesitation about publicly acknowledging my journey stemmed from lingering shame rather than privacy concerns. Despite my professional progress, some part of me still carried the weight of Mark's betrayal as personal failure rather than his limitation. Perhaps the most powerful strategic decision I could make was not about menu design or kitchen equipment, but about reclaiming my narrative, transforming even the painful parts of my experience into elements of strength and authenticity. I replied to James, "Let's meet with them next week. I'm ready to own my story." The heat of the kitchen enveloped me as I moved between stations, observing my newly assembled team execute the practice dinner service. 6 weeks before Maison Sauvage's official opening, we were conducting nightly rehearsals, refining techniques, adjusting timing, and building the collaborative rhythm essential to a successful restaurant. "Sophie, the sauce is reducing too quickly," I noted, my tone firm but instructive rather than critical. "Lower the heat and watch the consistency. Remember, we're looking for silk, not velvet." My sous chef nodded, immediately adjusting the flame beneath her pan. At 28, Sophie Martinez had worked in several prestigious kitchens before joining our team on Chef Bernard's recommendation. Her technical skills were impeccable, and she had quickly become my most trusted lieutenant in the controlled chaos of our developing kitchen. "Chef, the produce delivery included these," called Miguel, our garde-manger, holding up a bunch of vibrant purple carrots. "They're not on the spec sheet, but the quality is exceptional." I examined the unexpected ingredient, mind already calculating potential applications. Set them aside. We'll develop a special for tomorrow's practice service. This flexibility, the ability to adapt menus to showcase exceptional seasonal ingredients, was central to the culinary philosophy we were developing at Maison Sauvage. Unlike the rigid, predetermined menus of my formal training, our restaurant would embrace the improvisational aspect of truly responsive cooking. The kitchen crew, 10 talented individuals I'd selected through an exhaustive interview process, moved with increasing confidence through the space we'd designed together. The layout reflected both classical kitchen hierarchy and modern collaborative workflows, traditional stations arranged to facilitate communication and cooperation rather than isolation. 30 minutes to simulated first seating, announced. Daniel, our pastry chef, glancing at the clock as he meticulously piped delicate rosettes on the dessert course. Prep status? A chorus of readiness confirmations echoed through the kitchen. In the weeks since hiring my team, we had developed efficient communication protocols that minimized unnecessary chatter while ensuring everyone remained synchronized during service. I stepped back from the central island, observing the orchestra I was learning to conduct. 5 months ago, I had been a student in Chef Bernard's classroom, absorbing techniques and terminology. Now I stood at the helm of a professional kitchen, responsible not just for my own performance, but for cultivating excellence in others. Claire, James appeared at my side, clipboard in hand. The front-of-house team is ready for the walkthrough whenever the kitchen hits a natural pause. I nodded, appreciating his sensitivity to kitchen workflow, another indication of our effective partnership. Where the relationship with Mark had been characterized by interruption and diminishment, my collaboration with James was built on mutual respect and complementary expertise. 10 minutes, then we'll break, I confirmed, making a final round of the stations to ensure everything was on track. In the dining room, the transformation from construction site to elegant restaurant was nearly complete. Custom tables handcrafted from reclaimed wood gleamed beneath carefully positioned lighting designed to flatter both food and diners. The open kitchen, visible through a wide archway, allowed guests to witness the culinary process while maintaining enough separation to preserve the dining experience. Amanda, our newly hired general manager, led the assembled servers through their paces, explaining the philosophy behind our service approach. At Maison Sauvage, we're creating a narrative through food, she emphasized, echoing the vision James and I had articulated during her interview. Each course tells a chapter of the story, and your role is to guide guests through that journey without imposing on their experience. I watched as the servers practiced their synchronized movement through the dining room, noting their growing comfort with the choreography we'd designed. Like the kitchen team, they represented a careful blend of experience and potential. Some veterans of fine dining establishments, others newer to the industry, but selected for their intelligence and genuine passion for hospitality. The reservation system is fully implemented, James informed me as we observed the training. We're already at 90% capacity for the first month, based solely on industry word of mouth and the press coverage of your graduation from Le Cordon Bleu. The mention of the press attention caused a brief flutter of discomfort. As promised, the PR firm James had engaged had helped me navigate how much of my personal journey to share publicly. The resulting profile in the city's premier food magazine had focused on my transition from accomplished home cook to professional chef, acknowledging my marriage's end as a catalyst without delving into painful specifics. Mark had seen the article. His lawyer had referenced it during our settlement meeting as evidence of my substantial earning potential, attempting to reduce his financial obligations accordingly. The transparent attempt to capitalize on my success while simultaneously undermining it had only reinforced the wisdom of my decision to rebuild my life without him. Chef. Sophie approached with a small plate. The amuse-bouche concept you suggested. I've adjusted the acid balance as you recommended. I tasted the bite-sized offering, noting the perfect equilibrium between richness and brightness. Excellent. This is exactly what we're aiming for. Familiar elements transformed through technique into something surprising, yet still comforting. That's becoming our signature, isn't it? Sophie observed. Transformation through technique, taking the overlooked or undervalued and revealing its true potential. The parallel to my personal journey wasn't lost on me. Exactly. It's not about disguising ingredients or obscuring their nature. It's about honoring their inherent qualities through proper treatment and presentation. As the front-of-house training concluded, James gathered both teams for a unified briefing. 2 weeks from today, we conduct our first full-service rehearsal with invited guests, he announced. 1 week after that, we welcome food critics and media for preview dinners. And then, he paused, looking around the assembled staff. We open our doors to the public. A ripple of excitement passed through the group. For many, this was their first experience opening a new restaurant. For others, Maison Sauvage represented an opportunity to be part of something more personally meaningful than their previous positions. Chef Winters and I have designed Maison Sauvage to be more than just another fine dining establishment, James continued. We're creating a place that celebrates transformation of ingredients, of expectations, and of the dining experience itself. Each of you plays an essential role in delivering that vision. As the staff dispersed to continue their preparations, I realized how dramatically my own circumstances had transformed in the months since Mark's departure. Where I had once sought approval for the simplest culinary explorations, I now directed a professional kitchen implementing my vision. Where financial insecurity had initially threatened my independence, I now stood as an equal partner in a significant business venture. A penny for your thoughts, chef, James said, noting my momentary reflection. Just appreciating the journey, I replied. 6 months ago, I was standing in an empty apartment, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake pursuing this path. James nodded, understanding the unspoken aspects of my statement. And now? I gestured toward the kitchen, where my team had resumed their practiced coordination, and the dining room, where servers continued refining their movements. Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, building something meaningful from what once seemed like ruins. The metaphor extended beyond my personal circumstances to the restaurant itself. A former industrial space transformed into a place of culinary innovation, its original character preserved but repurposed toward new creation. As I returned to the kitchen to oversee the completion of the practice service, I carried a deep awareness of how thoroughly both I and my circumstances had evolved. The technical skills I'd developed under Chef Bernard's exacting guidance had been augmented by leadership abilities I never knew I possessed. The creative instincts Mark had dismissed as impractical flourishes had become the distinctive elements that distinguished our concept in a competitive market. Most significantly, the woman who had once measured her culinary ambitions against her husband's approval had been replaced by a chef who recognized the value of her unique perspective, who understood that her unconventional path provided precisely the authentic voice the culinary world respected. "Ready for tasting, chef?" Sophie called, signaling that the practice dinner service was complete. I gathered with my team around the pass, evaluating each dish not just for technical execution, but for how effectively it conveyed our culinary narrative. The growth evident in their work mirrored my own development, tentative early efforts evolving into confident expressions of shared vision. "This," I said, gesturing to the assembled courses, "is exactly why we will succeed. Because we understand that true culinary excellence isn't just about technical perfection. It's about creating experiences that resonate emotionally while surprising intellectually." Their collective focus as I spoke confirmed what I had been gradually accepting. I had become not just a chef, but a leader, someone whose vision inspired others to reach beyond comfortable competence toward genuine innovation. The journey from Mark's dismissive assessment to this moment of professional fulfillment had been neither straight nor easy. Yet each challenge, from financial insecurity to self-doubt to practical obstacles, had contributed essential elements to my transformation. As we completed our evaluation and began preparations for the following day's practice service, I carried a quiet certainty that transcended mere professional confidence. Whatever the future held, success or setback, acclaim or criticism, I now possessed something Mark's betrayal had inadvertently made possible: the unshakable knowledge of my own capacity for growth, adaptation, and authentic creation. The kitchen of Maison Sauvage moved with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. 2 months after our grand opening, we had settled into the controlled chaos that characterized successful restaurants, each service presenting unique challenges that my team now handled with confident adaptability. Table 9 has requested a modification to the duck preparation, Sophie announced, sliding the ticket onto my station. Guest has a shallot allergy. Substitute caramelized fennel and proceed, I replied without hesitation, mentally recalibrating the dish to maintain its balance without its original aromatic base. 6 months ago, such a deviation might have flustered me. Now it represented an opportunity to demonstrate the creative flexibility that had become our kitchen's hallmark. The rhythm of service flowed around me as I put the finishing touches on the table 12 entrees, a perfect circle of line cooks, servers, and kitchen assistants moving through their coordinated dance. The satisfaction of witnessing this harmony, a manifestation of the systems and culture we'd carefully developed, surpassed even the pleasure of creating the dishes themselves. "Chef," called Miguel from the pass, the food writer from Taste. "Magazine just ordered the chef's tasting menu with wine pairings." I nodded acknowledgement, sharing a meaningful glance with Sophie. Taste magazine's influence in the culinary world was substantial. Their reviews could cement a restaurant's reputation or undermine months of careful work. We had received positive mentions in several publications since opening, but this would be our first formal evaluation from a major national food publication. "Standard procedure," I reminded the kitchen team, my voice calm despite the momentary spike in adrenaline. "No special treatment, no deviations from our established standards. The food speaks for itself." James appeared briefly at the kitchen entrance, catching my eye with a subtle nod that confirmed he was aware of our important guest. In the months since opening, our partnership had evolved into an almost telepathic understanding, his front-of-house expertise complementing my culinary direction without either domain encroaching on the other. As service continued, I maintained my focus on consistent execution, rather than allowing the critic's presence to disrupt our established rhythms. When her table's tasting menu began, I personally inspected each course before it left the kitchen, not deviating from our standard presentations, but ensuring absolute perfection in execution. 4 hours later, as the final diners departed and the kitchen commenced its nightly cleaning ritual, James joined me at the pass with 2 glasses of champagne. "To another successful service," he said, handing me a flute. "And to Taste Magazine's critic cleaning, her plate on every course." I smiled, accepting the glass. "The real test will be the written review. Critics can be enthusiastic diners and still find fault in the retelling." "Always the cautious one," James teased, though his expression held genuine respect. Meanwhile, I received 3 calls today from potential investors interested in backing our second location. Word is spreading about what we've created here. The casual mention of expansion sent a small thrill through my exhausted body. When we developed the concept for Maison Sauvage, James had mentioned the possibility of multiple restaurants if our initial venture proved successful. That this possibility was materializing so quickly exceeded even our optimistic projections. "Let's focus on maintaining excellence here before diluting our attention," I cautioned, though the idea of extending our culinary vision to new concepts was undeniably exciting. "Of course," James agreed readily. "But it's worth noting that your reputation in the culinary community is growing exponentially. Bernard mentioned that 3 of his current students cited you as their inspiration for entering the professional program." This information affected me more deeply than anticipated. The idea that my journey might inspire others to pursue their culinary passions, perhaps even those who, like me, had suppressed their ambitions due to others' limited vision, felt like the most meaningful measure of success. As the kitchen staff completed their closing duties, I gathered them for our nightly debrief, a practice I'd instituted to reinforce our culture of continuous improvement. "Outstanding execution tonight," I began, acknowledging their collective achievement. The consistency between tables, even, with multiple modifications, demonstrated exactly the adaptive excellence we've been working toward. I proceeded with specific observations, commending Miguel's plate compositions, noting an opportunity for more precise timing between the fish and meat courses, recognizing Daniel's innovative twist on our signature dessert. "Tomorrow we implement the seasonal menu adjustments," I concluded. "Review your station's changes before prep begins. Questions?" The absence of questions reflected not lack of engagement, but the thorough preparation we'd conducted during development of the seasonal transitions. Unlike the rigid, calendar-driven menu changes of many restaurants, Maison Sauvage's approach responded to ingredient availability and quality, sometimes introducing new dishes incrementally rather than in complete menu overhauls. As the team dispersed, Sophie lingered at her station, making additional notes in her already comprehensive prep list for the following day. "Everything all right?" I asked, recognizing the slightly furrowed brow that indicated she was wrestling with a culinary challenge. "Just thinking about the new squash preparation," she replied, "wondering if we might enhance the textural contrast by adding a crisp element, perhaps fried sage or toasted pepitas." I considered her suggestion, mentally tasting the combination. "Good instinct. Let's test both tomorrow during family meal and decide which better complements the dish's overall composition." Sophie's thoughtful nod acknowledged the balanced approach, neither dismissing her creative contribution nor accepting it without proper evaluation. This collaborative refinement process had become a hallmark of our kitchen culture, encouraging creative input while maintaining consistent standards. Later, after changing from my chef's whites into casual clothes, I found James waiting in the small office we shared at the rear of the restaurant. The space reflected our complementary approaches, his precisely organized business documents alongside my sprawling recipe developments and menu iterations. "Before you head home," he said, sliding a folder across the desk, "you might want to see these?" Inside were printouts of recent social media posts and food blog entries about Maison Sauvage. The frequency of mentions had steadily increased since our opening, but what caught my attention was the nature of the commentary. Not just praise for specific dishes, but recognition of the distinctive perspective informing our entire approach. "Chef Winters brings a unique sensibility to classical techniques," I read aloud from one review. "Her dishes honor traditional foundations while transcending them through unexpected elements that feel like revelations rather than gimmicks." "They're recognizing exactly what makes your culinary voice special," James observed. "Not just technical proficiency, but the authentic perspective you bring to every creation." I continued scanning the reviews, noting the recurring themes: transformation, revelation, rediscovery. The language echoed my own journey from home cook to executive chef, from someone whose talents had been relegated to hobby status to a professional whose vision warranted serious critical attention. "There's something else," James said, his tone shifting slightly. "I received a call from the Culinary Institute. They're interested in having you speak to their advanced students about non-traditional paths to professional success." The invitation represented a particular kind of validation, recognition from the established culinary education system that alternative journeys like mine had value worth sharing with the next generation of chefs. "I'll consider it," I replied, though the idea of positioning myself as an authority figure to culinary students still felt somewhat presumptuous despite our restaurant's growing success. James seemed to read my hesitation. "Claire, you've created something remarkable here," Not just excellent food, but a distinctive culinary philosophy and a kitchen culture that nurtures rather than crushes creativity. That's worth sharing, particularly with students trying to find their own path. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone chimed with an incoming email. The sender made my heart skip momentarily. Mark Winters. For months, our communication had been conducted exclusively through attorneys as we finalized our divorce settlement. The process had concluded 6 weeks earlier, just as Maison Sauvage was gaining serious attention in the culinary world. Since then, there had been no contact, a circumstance I had found both appropriate and relieving. I hesitated, then opened the message. Claire, I've been meaning to write since seeing the profile of your restaurant in the Tribune last month. The success you've achieved in such a short time is truly remarkable. I find myself wondering if you would consider meeting for coffee sometime. There are things I'd like to say in person rather than via email. Regardless of your decision, please know that I recognize how thoroughly I underestimated what you were capable of creating. Mark James, noting my extended silence, raised a questioning eyebrow. Mark, I explained, turning the phone so he could see the message. Apparently my ex-husband would like to meet for coffee. Ah, James replied, his expression carefully neutral. And how do you feel about that? I considered the question, searching for the emotional response that would have been immediate and intense just months ago. To my surprise, what I found instead was a quiet detachment, not the raw pain of betrayal or the defensive anger of early healing, but something approaching indifference. I'm not sure there's anything to be gained from such a meeting, I said finally. Whatever closure he's seeking isn't something I need to provide. The realization struck me with sudden clarity. My success wasn't defined by Mark's recognition of it. The validation I had once craved from him, acknowledgement of my culinary talent and professional potential, now seemed entirely irrelevant compared to the authentic affirmation I received daily through my work and its reception. As I walked to my car in the restaurant's reserved parking area, I reflected on how thoroughly my measures of success had transformed along with my circumstances. The external markers, positive reviews, growing reservations, industry recognition, were gratifying, but secondary to the deeper satisfaction of creating food that expressed my unique perspective while nurturing both my team and our guests. Mark's belated recognition, delivered from the safe distance of a carefully worded email, represented a chapter already concluded rather than validation I still required. My rising success existed independent of his assessment, a reality I had created through vision, determination, and the support of those who recognized my potential when he had not. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through my apartment windows as I reviewed the catering proposal for Ember and Vine's grand opening event. 4 months into Maison Sauvage's successful operation, we were preparing to launch our second restaurant, a more casual Mediterranean concept that would extend our culinary philosophy to a broader audience. The staffing plan looks solid, I commented to Sophie, who had arrived early to finalize details before heading to the restaurant. Her recent promotion to executive chef of Maison Sauvage had been a natural evolution, freeing me to divide my attention between our existing restaurant and the new venture. I've selected team members from both restaurants for the event, she confirmed, highlighting names on the document. It creates a sense of unified culture while giving the Ember and Vine staff a chance to work alongside our more experienced team. I nodded approvingly, appreciating her strategic thinking. In the months since opening Maison Sauvage, Sophie had evolved from talented sous chef to genuine leadership material. Someone who internalized not just techniques, but underlying philosophies. James called while you were making coffee, she added, glancing at her notes. The final media list for tomorrow's preview dinner includes all the major publications and food blogs. He specifically mentioned that Carlton Financial's annual client appreciation dinner is happening at the Westbrook Hotel tomorrow night as well. I paused, the the significance of this information registering immediately. Carlton Financial was Mark's company, the client appreciation dinner, an annual event I had attended for years as his wife, often providing suggestions for the menu that went unacknowledged. "He thought you should know," Sophie continued, watching my reaction carefully, "given the potential for unexpected encounters." The thoughtful warning was characteristic of both Sophie and James, their protective instincts balanced with respect for my ability to handle difficult situations. Unlike Mark, who had alternately shielded me from realities he deemed too complex or exposed me to social situations without proper preparation, my current partners treated me as a capable equal, while still offering appropriate support. "Thank you for the heads up," I replied, my mind already calculating the implications. "The Westbrook is across the street from Ember and Vine. Given the timing of both events, the potential for overlap is significant." Sophie nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Though I had shared only minimal details about my divorce with my team, they had pieced together enough from media coverage and occasional references to understand the basic outline of my history with Mark. "Do you want us to adjust the timeline for the preview dinner?" she asked practically. "We could shift earlier or later to minimize the chance of intersection." I considered the suggestion briefly before shaking my head. "No, we've planned this. Launch meticulously. I won't allow old history to disrupt our momentum." The confident decisiveness of my response reflected how thoroughly I had evolved in the months since opening Maison Sauvage. Where I had once structured my life to accommodate Mark's preferences and avoid potential discomfort, I now made decisions based on business priorities and professional standards rather than emotional hesitation. As Sophie departed for Maison Sauvage, I lingered over my coffee, contemplating the potential encounter with Mark. His email requesting coffee had remained unanswered, my focus directed toward building our restaurant group rather than revisiting closed chapters of my personal history. Yet the possibility of seeing him, particularly in the context of Ember and Vine's high-profile launch, created an unexpected opportunity for definitive closure. My phone chimed with a text from James. "Final walkthrough at E&V at 10 a.m. Designer. Made the adjustments to lighting we discussed." I texted back confirmation while gathering the materials for my day. Notebook filled with recipe refinements, tablet containing operational plans, and the small leather-bound journal that had documented my culinary journey from talented home cook to restaurateur. This daily arsenal represented the tangible tools of my transformation, each item supporting the vision that had emerged from the ruins of my former life. The drive to Ember and Vine took me through the financial district where Carlton Tower stood among other corporate headquarters. I felt a momentary surrealism passing the building where I had once attended countless corporate functions as Mark's wife. Always introduced as an afterthought, my identity subsumed by his professional position. Tomorrow night, if our paths crossed, as seemed increasingly likely, the dynamic would be fundamentally different. I would be Chef Claire Winters, the creative force behind 2 acclaimed restaurants, while he remained in the same role he had occupied throughout our marriage. The reversal wasn't about petty vindication, but about the natural consequence of embracing my authentic path while he remained within comfortable familiar patterns. At Ember and Vine, James waited outside the copper-accented entrance, reviewing details with Amanda, who would manage the new location after successfully overseeing Maison Sauvage's front-of-house operations. "Everything is proceeding perfectly," he greeted me, his expression reflecting the controlled excitement that characterized our partnership. "The kitchen team completed their final practice service last night with 0 errors. As we entered the space that would officially open to the public in 48 hours, I felt a surge of pride in what we had created. Not just a second successful restaurant, but the foundation of a culinary identity that transcended individual locations to become a recognizable philosophy. "Tomorrow night," James said as we completed our inspection, "will be the formal introduction of Chef Claire Winters as a culinary force beyond a single successful restaurant. The critics and investors will recognize what we've known all along, that Your vision has the depth and distinctiveness to sustain an entire restaurant group. The evolution from Mark's dismissal of my hobby to this moment of professional expansion created a symmetry that felt appropriate for whatever encounter might occur at tomorrow's events. I was prepared, not for confrontation or vindication, but for the simple revelation of who I had become in the absence of limitation. Ember and Vine glowed with warm copper accents and Mediterranean-inspired details. The space transformed from empty potential to vibrant reality. Food critics, industry insiders, and influential journalists moved through the restaurant, sampling signature dishes while engaging with our culinary team. The preview dinner had exceeded even our ambitious expectations, with spontaneous applause, erupting after the presentation of our show-stopping seafood paella, a dish that symbolized our commitment to communal dining experiences and vibrant flavors. "Chef Winters, this is revolutionary," declared Elaine Mercer, the notoriously critical reviewer for the Culinary Quarterly. "The way you've balanced traditional techniques with contemporary sensibilities creates something genuinely new while respecting cultural foundations." I accepted her praise with genuine gratitude, noting how differently I received professional recognition now compared to my early days at Maison Sauvage, where I had once felt almost apologetic about positive attention. I now acknowledged it as the earned result of vision, discipline, and authenticity. "Thank you, Elaine. Our approach at both restaurants centers on transformation through respect, elevating traditions rather than reinventing them." I gestured toward the open kitchen where my hand-picked team executed each dish with practiced precision. The collaborative culture is as important as the culinary technique. As we continued our conversation, James appeared at my elbow with subtle urgency in his expression. "Claire, there's a situation at the entrance you should be aware of." I excused myself from Elaine and followed James toward the host station, where Amanda stood in conversation with a group of elegantly dressed individuals. Even from a distance, I recognized Mark immediately, his tailored suit and confident posture unmistakable, despite the months since our last encounter. "Carlton Financial's client dinner ended early," James explained quietly. "Apparently, several guests expressed interest in visiting the new restaurant they'd been reading about in the press." "How many?" I asked, immediately shifting to professional. "Assessment rather than personal reaction. 6. Mark, a woman I assume is Rebecca, and 4 clients." I nodded, decision already made. "Have Amanda seat them in the Riverview section. Prepare the chef's selection menu with premium wine pairings. I'll handle the table personally." James studied my expression, seeking confirmation that I was genuinely comfortable with this approach. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." My confidence wasn't bravado, but the genuine self-possession that had developed through months of professional success. "This is my restaurant, James. I'm not ceding control of the narrative to anyone." As Amanda led Mark's party to their table, I returned to the kitchen to supervise preparation of their specialized menu. The team responded to my instructions with focused efficiency, understanding without explanation that this particular table warranted the chef's personal attention. 20 minutes later, I emerged from the kitchen carrying the first course myself, a selection of Mediterranean small plates, arranged with artistic precision. Mark had not yet noticed me, his attention focused on explaining something to his clients with characteristic, authoritative gestures. "Good evening," I greeted the table, my voice professionally warm as I placed the first course at the center. "I'm Chef Claire Winters, creator of Ember and Vine. We're delighted to welcome you to our preview event." Mark's head snapped up at the sound of my voice, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. Beside him, Rebecca's eyes widened in recognition, her hand instinctively moving to touch his arm, a gesture reminiscent of insecurity rather than affection. "Claire," Mark managed, recovering his composure with visible effort. This is your restaurant?" "One of them," I replied simply. "Maison Sauvage, which has been open for 4 months, is our flagship fine dining concept. Ember and Vine represents Our approach to elevated Mediterranean cuisine in a more accessible format. The clients, two couples who had attended numerous corporate functions during my marriage, looked between us with growing interest, clearly connecting the dots of our shared history. Mark mentioned you had opened a restaurant, one of the women offered, her tone suggesting she had dramatically underestimated the scale of my venture. But we had no idea you were behind both Maison Sauvage and this beautiful space. Chef Winters has become quite the culinary force in our city, Rebecca added with surprising graciousness, her tone suggesting genuine respect rather than the resentment of our previous encounter. Her story has been featured in several major publications. I acknowledged her comment with a slight nod before returning to my professional role. I've selected a special tasting menu that showcases our signature dishes. The first course features house-cured olives, charred eggplant with preserved lemon, and spiced lamb kofta with yogurt sauce. As I described each element, I maintained eye contact with the table collectively rather than focusing on Mark, whose stunned expression had settled into something more complex, a mixture of disbelief and what appeared to be genuine admiration. "This looks extraordinary," he finally said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of deference. "Thank you for accommodating us without a reservation." "Of course. Hospitality is central to our philosophy." I gestured toward the open kitchen, visible from their table. "Your next course will arrive shortly. Please enjoy." As I turned to leave, Mark spoke again, his voice lowered for my ears alone. "Claire, I had no idea. This is remarkable. Truly." I paused, meeting his gaze directly, for the first time. "Thank you, Mark. Success often looks remarkable to those who couldn't envision it." The subtle reference to his dismissal of my potential registered in his expression, but I continued before he could respond. "Please enjoy your evening. Sophie, my executive chef at Maison Sauvage, will oversee your remaining courses." The controlled grace with which I navigated this unexpected encounter reflected my evolution from the woman who had once deferred to Mark's judgment in all things. Where I had once sought his approval, I now accepted his belated recognition as merely one perspective among many and far from the most significant validation I had received. As I returned to circulating among the other guests, I caught James watching me with quiet pride. He had witnessed my journey from talented but uncertain culinary student to confident restaurateur, supporting my vision without attempting to control or direct it, the fundamental difference between partnership and possession that Mark had never understood. The revelation of my success was complete, not in Mark's stunned recognition, but in my own unshakable certainty that I had created something authentic and valuable. Whatever his reaction, regret, admiration, or something between, it changed. Nothing about the path I continued to travel with growing confidence. The morning after Ember and Vine's triumphant preview dinner, I arrived early at my test kitchen, the converted warehouse space that had become my creative sanctuary. Here, away from the operational demands of two busy restaurants, I could experiment with new techniques and flavor combinations that might eventually appear on our menus. Sunlight streamed through the industrial windows, illuminating the pristine workspace as I arranged ingredients for a new dessert concept. The rhythmic chopping of pistachios and measured pouring of orange blossom water created a meditative beginning to my day, allowing space to process the previous evening's encounter with Mark. I had expected to feel something more dramatic after our first face-to-face meeting since the divorce. Perhaps vindication or lingering resentment. Instead, what surprised me most was the emotional neutrality of the experience. Mark had once occupied the central role in my life, his opinions and preferences shaping my choices in ways both obvious and subtle. Now he had become simply another patron in my restaurant, one with a complicated history, certainly, but no longer someone whose assessment carried special weight. The door opened, and Sophie entered carrying 2 cups of coffee from the artisanal roaster down the street. "Thought you might need this after last night," she said, setting one beside my workstation. That was quite the unexpected situation. I smiled, accepting the coffee gratefully. Thanks. How did the rest of their meal go? They stayed until closing, Sophie reported, leaning against the opposite counter. Ordered additional wine after the pairing, and your ex-husband kept asking questions about the restaurant group's expansion plans. I raised an eyebrow, continuing to prepare the orange-infused syrup. Expansion plans? That's not public information yet, Sophie shrugged. He seemed very interested in the business aspects, financing structure, growth strategy, whether we plan to seek additional investors. I kept my responses appropriately vague. The information didn't particularly surprise me. Mark had always viewed achievements primarily through financial metrics, measuring success by growth potential and investment opportunity, rather than creative fulfillment or cultural impact. After they left, Sophie continued with slight hesitation. Rebecca stayed behind for a moment. Asked me to give you this. She handed me a folded note written on Ember and Vine's custom stationery. I opened it, curious about what Mark's girlfriend might want to communicate. Claire. What you've created is extraordinary, as is the journey that brought you here. Thank you for your gracious hospitality despite our complicated history. The path forward isn't always what we expect, but authenticity eventually finds its proper place. With genuine admiration, Rebecca. The unexpected graciousness of the note touched me more deeply than I anticipated. The woman who had once been cast as my adversary had somehow recognized and acknowledged the deeper significance of my professional transformation. She seems different than I expected, Sophie observed, having clearly noted my thoughtful expression. People often are, I replied, returning to my recipe development. Especially when we allow ourselves to see beyond the roles we've assigned them in our own narratives. As the morning progressed, James joined us to discuss Ember and Vine's official opening the following evening. The preview dinner had generated precisely the industry buzz we'd hoped for, with early reviews already appearing online and reservations flooding in for the coming months. The investors are ecstatic, he reported, reviewing the preliminary financial projections. They're already asking about the third concept we discussed potentially developing next year. I continued piping delicate rosewater cream onto the orange pistachio base, considering the rapid expansion of our restaurant group. Let's ensure both current restaurants are operating at peak excellence before dividing our attention further. Sustainable growth requires solid foundations, James nodded approvingly. Always the voice of balanced perspective. That's why we work so well together. He hesitated briefly before continuing. Speaking of last night's events, Mark called my office this morning. I looked up from my work, genuinely surprised. What did he want? To discuss potential investment in our restaurant group. James watched my reaction carefully. He mentioned being impressed by the business model and interested in supporting the expansion phase. The irony was almost too perfect, Mark seeking to invest in the culinary vision he had once dismissed as an impractical hobby. For a brief moment, I imagined the satisfaction of rejecting his offer, of denying him participation in the success he had failed to anticipate. Instead, I found myself considering the proposal from a purely professional perspective. What would be the practical impact of his investment? Would it accelerate our growth timeline or provide strategic advantages? James appeared slightly surprised by my pragmatic response. Potentially, yes. His firm has connections that could facilitate expansion into the downtown financial district, which aligns with our long-term vision. But Claire, this decision is ultimately yours. Given your history, no one would question you declining his involvement. I returned to my dessert. Preparation, carefully arranging candied orange peel in a precise pattern. The restaurants aren't about my personal history, James. They're about creating something meaningful that stands on its own merits. I looked up, meeting his gaze directly. If Mark's investment makes business sense and comes without creative control stipulations, we should consider it objectively, just as we would any other potential investor. Sophie, who had been quietly observing our exchange, spoke up with characteristic directness. "That's remarkably generous, considering how thoroughly he underestimated your potential." I smiled, recognizing the protective instinct behind her comment. "It's not generosity, Sophie. It's liberation. Making decisions based on vindication or resentment would mean I'm still operating within the emotional framework of my marriage. True transformation means moving beyond those limitations entirely." As I completed the dessert presentation, a modern interpretation of traditional Middle Eastern flavors, I realized that my journey had indeed transcended the initial motivation of proving Mark wrong. What had begun as a quest for validation had evolved into something far more significant: the authentic expression of my culinary voice and the creation of a business that reflected my values rather than merely my technical skills. "Set up a preliminary meeting with Mark and his financial team," I instructed James, photographing the completed dessert for our development archives. "No commitments, just exploration of potential alignment. And make it clear that investment does not confer creative influence. Our culinary direction remains exclusively under my authority." The declaration contained no defensiveness or insecurity, simply the clear boundaries of a successful professional who understood her value. Where I had once sought Mark's approval, I now offered him the opportunity to recognize a good investment, a fundamentally different dynamic that reflected how thoroughly our respective positions had evolved. The evening sun cast a golden glow across the private dining room of Maison Sauvage, where our executive team had gathered to celebrate a remarkable milestone: 1 year since opening our flagship restaurant. The elegant space, typically reserved for exclusive parties, had been transformed for our private celebration with seasonal flowers, handwritten menu cards, and vintage champagne chilling in silver buckets. James raised his glass, commanding the attention of the assembled group, the core team that had been instrumental in building our restaurant empire from concept to thriving reality. "To Chef Claire Winters," he declared, his voice carrying genuine admiration, "whose vision, resilience, and extraordinary talent have created not just successful restaurants, but a new standard of culinary excellence in our city." Applause rippled around the table as Sophie, Amanda, and the other key staff members joined the toast. I accepted their recognition with a quiet confidence that had replaced the habitual self-deprecation of my former life. "Thank you all," I responded, surveying the faces of those who had become both colleagues and family during this transformative year. "But this celebration belongs to everyone in this room. What we've built together exceeds anything I could have created alone." The truth of this statement resonated deeply as I reflected on our collective journey. In 12 short months, we had established 3 distinctive restaurants, each successful in its own right, while contributing to our overarching culinary philosophy. Maison Sauvage had earned a coveted Michelin star in record time. Ember and Vine had been named Best New Casual Concept by the city's premier dining magazine, and our newest venture, Wild Root, focused on hyper-local ingredients, had opened to immediate acclaim just 6 weeks earlier. As the first course arrived, an homage to the original dishes that had launched Maison Sauvage, I observed the easy camaraderie around the table. Sophie, now the corporate executive chef overseeing all 3 restaurant kitchens, engaged in animated discussion with Marcus, whom we'd promoted to executive chef at Ember and Vine. Amanda coordinated with her counterparts from the other locations, sharing best practices for managing the consistently high demand at all our venues. "The investment group meets tomorrow to finalize the expansion funding," James mentioned as conversation turned to business matters. "With the additional capital, we'll be positioned to explore the coastal location we discussed for the seafood concept." I nodded, mentally reviewing the carefully considered growth strategy we'd developed. Unlike the frenetic expansion that had undermined many promising restaurant groups, our approach prioritized sustainability and quality control over rapid proliferation. "Has Mark confirmed his participation in the investment round?" Sophie asked, Her initial skepticism about his involvement having evolved into pragmatic acceptance over the past few months. Yes, James confirmed. Carlton Financial has committed to the percentage we discussed, with the stipulations Claire established regarding operational autonomy. The mention of Mark's investment firm prompted a brief reflection on how thoroughly our dynamic had transformed. In the 6 months since our encounter at Ember and Vine's opening, we had established a strictly professional relationship, quarterly meetings to discuss business performance without venturing into personal territory. His initial attempts to re-establish a more personal connection had been met with polite but firm boundaries, eventually giving way to a mutual understanding that our only meaningful interaction would be through the restaurant group's business operations. Speaking of evolving situations, Amanda interjected with a knowing smile. Claire, are you going to share your news with the team? All eyes turned to me expectantly. I set down my glass, feeling a moment of vulnerability that quickly gave way to pride. I've been invited to participate in the James Beard Foundation's Celebrity Chef Tour, I announced. 6 cities, collaborating with some of the most innovative chefs in the country to raise funds for culinary education initiatives. The table erupted in enthusiastic congratulations. This invitation represented one of the highest recognitions in the American culinary world, typically reserved for chefs with decades of professional experience. The most significant aspect, I continued once the excitement had settled, is that a portion of the proceeds will fund a scholarship program I'm establishing for second-career culinary students, people pursuing professional training after age 40. This detail, which I hadn't previously shared with anyone besides James, reflected my commitment to creating pathways for others whose culinary ambitions might have been deferred by circumstances or discouragement. The program would provide not just financial support, but mentorship and guaranteed internships within our restaurant group. That's what this has always been about, I explained, gesturing to encompass our thriving enterprise. Not just personal success, but creating spaces where genuine talent can flourish regardless of conventional timing or traditional paths. As our celebration continued into the evening, I stepped away briefly to the restaurant's balcony, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. The city stretched before me, lights twinkling against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that urban landscape was the suburban home I'd once shared with Mark, the kitchen where I'd received the text messages that had shattered my marriage, the small apartment where I'd questioned my decision to pursue culinary training. Each location represented a station on the journey that had led to this moment of professional fulfillment and personal peace. The path had been neither direct nor easy, with financial challenges, self-doubt, and practical obstacles threatening at every turn. Yet each difficulty had contributed essential elements to both my culinary perspective and leadership approach. Taking in the view? James asked, joining me on the balcony with fresh glasses of champagne. Taking in the journey, I corrected, accepting the glass gratefully. Sometimes I still find it hard to believe we've created all this in just 1 year. Not hard to believe at all, he countered with characteristic confidence. Your talent was always there, Claire. It just needed the right conditions to fully express itself. The simple truth of his statement captured the essence of my transformation. Like the ingredients I worked with daily, my potential had required specific circumstances to reveal its full character. Freedom from limitation, exposure to supportive conditions, and the application of pressure that catalyzed growth rather than suppressing it. As we rejoined the celebration, I carried a profound awareness that the most significant element of my journey wasn't proving Mark wrong about my capabilities. It was discovering how thoroughly right I had been to trust my own vision when everyone else questioned it. The restaurants, the accolades, even the financial success were ultimately external validations of an internal certainty I had reclaimed through the painful dissolution of my marriage. The true resolution wasn't in surpassing expectations or achieving recognition, but in creating a life aligned with authentic purpose. One where success was measured not by comparison to others' limitations, but by the meaningful impact of work that represented my unique perspective, freely and fully expressed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.